Jack Hartford woke at 5:30, same as he had every morning for the past 30 years. The discipline had outlasted the uniform by nearly a decade. Survival instinct encoded so deeply that retirement could not erase it. His hand reached across the bed before his eyes opened, muscles remembering a gesture that no longer had purpose, finding only cool sheets where warmth should have been. 8 months now, 243 days, though he had stopped counting at 100. The reaching never stopped. The bedroom held the gray light of November pre-dawn, that colorless hour when the world exists in suspension between night and day. Jack lay still for a moment, listening to the silence that filled the house like water fills a drowned valley. No breathing beside him, no soft rustle of movement, no warmth radiating from the other side of the mattress they had shared for 28 years. Just absence, profound and relentless as tide. He sat up slowly, joints protesting with the particular complaints of a body that has been used hard and put away wet too many times. 56 years old, a quarter century in the Marine Corps, most of it in combat engineering. 2 tours in Iraq when the first war turned into the forever war. 1 tour in Afghanistan when they needed someone who could look at a pile of rubble and determine if it would kill the men who cleared it. More bridges built than he could count. More roads opened. More structures assessed under fire while bullets wrote their arguments in the air around him. The body remembered every bit of it, cataloged every impact, every fall, every night sleeping on ground that felt like concrete. His right knee ached when rain was coming. Always had, ever since that day outside Fallujah when the Humvee he was inspecting decided to introduce him to a ditch at high speed. His left shoulder clicked when he raised it above his head, a souvenir from a night in Kandahar when the wall he was bracing against stopped being a wall and became a memory. Small prices, he told himself. Others had paid more, much more. The ones who never came back paid everything. And the ones who came back but left pieces of themselves in the sand paid more than anyone should have to. The house felt too large in the silence, rooms multiplying in emptiness. Lisa had filled it somehow, even in her final months when the cancer had reduced her to skin and breath and eyes that still saw him clearly when nothing else made sense anymore. Even when she could barely move from room to room, leaning on the walker they both pretended was temporary, her presence had expanded to fill every corner. Now that she was gone, the walls seemed to retreat, the ceilings to lift, the floors to stretch into distances that made no geometric sense. Her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. Jack moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision, the same steps in the same order, muscle memory carrying him when thought faltered. Coffee, black, no sugar, in the mug she had given him 15 years ago, with USMC etched into the ceramic. Oatmeal with blueberries, measured precisely, cooked exactly 3 minutes. Vitamins laid out in the same order on the counter, taken with the same glass of water, filled to the same line. Structure was survival. Routine was sanity. The Corps had taught him that, and 28 years of marriage to a woman who understood him had reinforced it. He had laid out his hiking gear the night before, same as he would have prepped his kit before a patrol. The pack sat by the door, already weighted and balanced the way he had been taught at Quantico a lifetime ago, when his knees were still new and his back did not catalog every poor decision in its vertebrae. Every item had a purpose. Every ounce mattered. Redundancy where it counted, ruthless elimination where it did not. He did not pack for comfort. He had never packed for comfort. He packed for contingency, for the moment when everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and the difference between living and dying came down to whether you had thought about that moment before it arrived. The forecast called for clear weather, but weather lied. Weather lied enthusiastically, professionally, with malice of forethought. The mountains kept their own counsel, made their own rules, and punished those who believed the promises of distant meteorologists who had never felt the weight of altitude pressing down on their chests. The trail he had chosen followed an old frontier wagon route deep in the Olympic National Forest, Washington State. 160 miles northwest of Seattle, in the part of the peninsula where civilization thinned to nothing and the forest took over with a density that reduced sunlight to suggestion. Lisa had hiked it 3 times, always in late autumn when the crowds thinned to nothing and the forest revealed itself without pretense. She had described it to him during one of their last conversations. her voice already weakened by the cancer that had decided to settle in her lungs and stay, invited or not, welcome or not. "Finish the trail for me," she had said, her hand in his, thin and cool, bones visible under skin that had gone translucent. "Find what I found there." He had asked her what she meant. What was there to find on a hiking trail besides trees and mud and the occasional deer too accustomed to humans to run properly? She had smiled, the morphine softening the edges of her pain into something she could breathe around, and told him he would know when he saw it. Her eyes had been clear despite the drugs, focused despite the exhaustion that made every breath a negotiation with physics. He would know, she said. Trust her. 3 weeks later, she was gone. He had not been ready. 25 years of training men to face death, of standing in rooms where death was the likely outcome and keeping his hands steady and his voice level, and he had not been ready for hers. All that training, all that experience, and when it came time to let go of the one person who had seen him at his worst and stayed anyway, he had held on too tight and too long, as if stubbornness could negotiate with biology. The drive to the trailhead took 2 hours, maybe closer to 2.5 with the back roads still wet from rain that had fallen 3 days prior. Highway gave way to county road to gravel, gravel to dirt that tested the truck's suspension and Jack's patience in equal measure. Civilization peeled away in layers, each turn taking him deeper into the kind of quiet that made city people nervous and made Jack feel like he could breathe properly for the first time in months. The forest thickened as he drove, pressing close to the narrow track, branches scraping the paint on both sides. Old-growth Douglas fir towered overhead, their trunks disappearing into canopies so dense that the sky became a rumor. Jack drove with both hands on the wheel, alert to every rut and washout, eyes scanning ahead for the kind of damage that could turn a truck into an expensive anchor. The vehicle was older than his marriage had been, a '92 Ford that had rolled off the assembly line the year he and Lisa bought their first house. It ran clean and strong, asked for nothing but regular maintenance and respect. He trusted machines that showed their age honestly, that did not pretend to be anything other than what they were. The parking area was empty when he arrived. He had expected that. Mid-November, midweek, weather forecast marginal at best. Most people save their hiking for summer, for sunshine and guaranteed views and trails that did not require actual navigation skills. Jack preferred the harder seasons. They asked more of you. They revealed more about you. The easy trails told you nothing except that you could follow signs and avoid tripping over roots. He stepped out into air sharp enough to sting his lungs, cold enough to make his breath visible. The sky above the canopy was pale, cloudless for now, the kind of deceptive clarity that preceded Pacific Northwest storms, like a calm man preceded violence. Good enough. He shouldered his pack, tested the weight distribution, adjusted the hip belt and sternum strap, and checked his compass out of habit even though the trail was clearly marked. Marines checked, always. The trail began gently, a well-maintained path that followed a subtle incline through old-growth forest that predated the Constitution. Douglas fir towered overhead, their trunks wide enough that 3 men could not encircle them with linked arms, bark thick and deeply furrowed like the skin of ancient elephants. Western red cedar grew in the wetter areas, their bases fluted and massive, wood the color of blood and earth. The ground was soft with decades of fallen needles, a living carpet that muffled his footfalls and made his passage through the forest almost silent. Silence was not absence here. It was presence, thick and textured. The forest breathed around him, patient and utterly indifferent to his existence. He was a temporary disturbance, a brief interruption in a cycle that measured time in centuries rather than heartbeats. The trees did not care whether he lived or died, succeeded or failed, remembered or forgot. They simply were, and would continue to be long after he returned to whatever elements composed him. Jack moved at a steady pace, not fast but unrelenting, the same measured stride he had developed over thousands of miles of hiking and humping and marching under loads that made his current pack feel like a minor inconvenience. He had learned long ago that speed meant nothing on a long march. Speed burned energy you might need later. Consistency was everything. Consistent pace, consistent breathing, consistent focus. The pack rode high and tight on his shoulders, weight distributed properly between hips and back. No hot spots developed where straps cut into skin. No shifting or bouncing with each step. Good. Within the first hour, he began to notice the details Lisa must have seen. The small pieces of history that casual hikers walk past without recognition. Wagon wheel ruts were still visible in places where erosion had not claimed them. Parallel grooves cut deep into the earth and preserved by some combination of soil composition and shade and sheer stubbornness. Someone had dragged heavy loads through here, families carrying everything they owned and towards promises the West had made but could not always keep. He thought of the engineering required to move a laden wagon through this terrain without modern equipment. No bulldozers to cut switchbacks. No surveying equipment beyond a compass and a chain. Just determination and mathematics worked out in firelight. Men with dirty hands and tired backs, calculating grades and curves in their heads, because paper was expensive and mistakes were fatal. The trail rose and fell in long, measured curves that followed the natural contours of the land. Whoever had laid it out understood grade and drainage, understood that water was the enemy of any road and had to be managed, directed, controlled. Small ditches ran alongside the trail in strategic locations, overgrown now, but still functional, still carrying runoff away from the path the way they had been designed to do more than a century ago. Jack appreciated the work with the eyes of someone who had spent his career doing similar calculations under less forgiving circumstances. It took knowledge to build something that outlasted the builder by generations. It took vision to create something you would never see completed, never see used to its full purpose. He stopped once to drink water and eat a handful of trail mix, standing rather than sitting because sitting meant his muscles would cool and stiffen, and the next mile would be harder than it needed to be. Marines did not rest when they could stand. The forest around him was quiet but not silent. A raven called somewhere high in the canopy, its voice harsh and mocking, ancient sound in ancient trees. Wind moved through the upper branches with a sound like distant surf, the Pacific reminding him that it was close even if he could not see it. He checked his watch. 3 hours in. Right on schedule. The trail ahead curved east, following a ridgeline he could not yet see but knew was there from the topographic map he had studied until the contour lines were burned into his memory. It was then that he noticed the barometric pressure on his watch beginning to drop. Not drastically, not the precipitous plunge that signaled immediate danger, but steadily, the needle creeping downward in small increments that added up to warning if you knew how to read them. He looked up through gaps in the canopy. The sky had changed. Clouds were building to the west, thick and low and dark, the kind that carried weight and intent. The forecast had not predicted this. The forecast had been confident in its assessment of clear weather and light winds. The forecast had been wrong. Jack considered his options with the calm detachment of long training, the same mental process he had used to evaluate whether to advance or hold position when the situation was fluid and the information was incomplete. Turn back now, accept defeat, reach the truck before the weather turned serious, or continue forward, trust his gear and his experience, ride out whatever came in the shelter he knew existed somewhere ahead. The trail ahead was supposed to have a lean-to at the halfway point, a basic structure maintained by the Forest Service for hikers caught by weather or darkness. He could reach it in another 2 hours if he pushed his pace slightly, if his knees cooperated, if the trail remained passable. He decided to push forward. Marines did not retreat from weather. Weather was just another enemy, and enemies could be managed with proper preparation and tactical flexibility. The wind arrived first, gusting through the trees in sudden bursts that sent needles and small branches clattering to the ground like shrapnel. The temperature dropped noticeably, enough that he could feel it through his layers, cold air finding the gaps in his defenses and reminding him that comfort was always temporary. Jack zipped his jacket higher and kept moving, pace unchanged, breathing steady. The trail began to narrow, pressed in by encroaching undergrowths that suggested recent weather had knocked down trees and blocked the path, forcing detours that were not on any map. Fallen logs appeared more frequently, moss-covered and slick, forcing him to climb over or navigate around, adding time and effort to each mile. The first drops of rain were large and cold, striking the back of his neck with enough force to make him flinch despite himself. They came sporadically at first, scattered advanced scouts testing the defenses, then with increasing frequency as the main body of the storm moved into position. Within minutes, the sky opened. Rain fell in sheets, driven sideways by wind that seemed to come from every direction at once, chaotic and aggressive. Visibility collapsed to a matter of meters. The trail beneath his boots turned to mud, then to something approaching liquid, water pooling in depressions and turning every step into a negotiation with friction. Jack pulled up the hood of his jacket and continued, adjusting his stride to account for the degraded footing. This was not his first storm, not even his 100th. He had walked through worse in places where the rain was warm and thick, and the danger came from directions rain never fell. Mosul in the wet season, Helmand Province during the spring floods. But this was different. This was the Pacific Northwest in late autumn, where storms came off the ocean with a fury that could strip bark from trees and reshape hillsides overnight, where the wind did not ask permission and the rain did not negotiate. The trail began to disappear entirely. What had been a clear path was now a suggestion, then a guess, then nothing at all. Water pooled everywhere, erasing footprints almost as soon as Jack made them. Branches whipped across his face despite his best efforts to shield himself, leaving scratches he would find later when the adrenaline wore off. The wind howled through the upper canopy with a sound like something dying badly and slowly, a sustained scream that made thought difficult and communication impossible. He stopped and pulled out his map, trying to shield the laminated paper from the rain with his body. The effort was futile. Water found every gap, every opening, soaking the map despite the protection. The ink held, barely, but the details blurred at the edges. He traced his finger along the route, estimating his position based on time and pace and the faint landmarks he could still identify when the rain lessened fractionally. The shelter should be close, perhaps another mile, maybe less. But in this visibility, with the trail gone and the landmarks obscured, a mile might as well be 10. Navigation became a matter of dead reckoning, the ancient art of estimating position based on direction and distance traveled. Jack used his compass to maintain a general heading, trusting the instrument more than his senses, more than his instincts, more than the forest that seemed designed to confuse and mislead. The needle pointed true north regardless of what his eyes told him, regardless of how lost he felt. The forest all looked the same now, a gray confusion of trunks and shadow and water, vertical lines and horizontal rain. Time lost its shape. He could have been walking for minutes or hours. His body knew the difference, his muscles cataloging every step and every obstacle. But his mind had stopped counting. Focus narrowed to the immediate. Next step, next breath, next tree to navigate around. The macro objective, reaching the shelter, faded into abstraction. Only the micro mattered, only the now. It was the cold that finally made the decision for him. The rain had soaked through his outer layer, despite the supposedly waterproof fabric, finding the gaps in his defenses through sheer persistence and volume. His fingers were numb, no longer responding precisely to commands. His feet squelched in his boots, water having defeated the gaiters and found its way down through the laces. Hypothermia was not immediate, not the rapid collapse that killed in minutes. But it was coming, the core temperature dropping degree by degree, the body prioritizing vital organs over extremities, shutting down systems in a desperate attempt to preserve the center. He needed shelter. Not the ideal shelter he had been aiming for, not the planned destination with its promised dry floor and solid walls. Any shelter, anything that would stop the wind and keep the rain off long enough for him to stabilize his core temperature and reassess. He began to search more deliberately, sweeping his gaze left and right as he moved, looking for anything that suggested human construction or natural protection. The forest offered nothing. Trees, endless trees, undergrowth, thick and impenetrable. Mud, everywhere mud. Then, through the rain and the failing light and the gray confusion of storm, he saw something that did not belong. Straight lines where there should be curves. Right angles in organic chaos. Geometry imposed on wilderness. Jack changed direction without conscious thought, moving toward it with renewed focus born of need rather than curiosity. His engineering mind cataloged details before his conscious thought caught up, processing information in the background while his body navigated the terrain. Wood, weathered but intact. Structure, low and long and deliberately placed. Something built with intention, not grown by accident. He approached carefully, circling wide the way he had been trained to approach any unknown structure in a combat zone. Assess first. Observe. Look for signs of instability or danger. Do not commit until you understand what you are committing to. The shape resolves slowly through the rain and distance. Wheels, massive and iron-rimmed, half swallowed by earth and root, and more than a century of forest trying to reclaim what humans had imposed. A wagon frame above them, but modified, reinforced with additional beams that suggested someone who understood structural engineering. Walls had been raised around the original wagon body, logs fitted with precision, gaps chinked with something that had hardened and held, after God knew how many seasons of freezing and thawing. This was not an abandoned wagon left to rot when the owners moved on to easier ground. This was a wagon that had been transformed with purpose and care. Made permanent, made to endure, made to outlast its makers. Jack stood in the downpour, water streaming down his face and finding every gap in his defenses, and studied the structure with the eye of someone who had spent a career assessing whether things would stand or fall, whether men could trust their lives to steel and concrete, and the calculations of engineers who would never see the structures they designed put to the test. The engineering was sophisticated in ways that surprised him. Whoever had built this understood load-bearing and weight distribution. The roof pitch was calculated precisely to shed snow and rain efficiently, steep enough to prevent accumulation, but not so steep that construction became impossible with limited materials. The walls were double-layered for insulation, the gap between filled with something that still retained integrity. The foundation, such as it was, distributed the weight across those ancient wheels in a way that prevented the whole structure from sinking into the forest floor, despite decades of rain and erosion. It was a fortress, a tiny, forgotten fortress built by someone who refused to accept defeat, who looked at a wagon and saw possibility, who understood that survival was not a matter of luck, but of engineering and will. The wind gusted hard enough to stagger him, a physical blow that nearly knocked him off his feet. Rain drove into his face with stinging force, each drop a small assault. The decision made itself. Jack moved to the door. It was a solid slab of wood, thick and heavy, reinforced with iron hardware that had rusted to a deep brown, but had not failed. The wood itself was intact, no rot visible, no soft spots where water had found a way in and begun the slow work of decomposition. A latch hung on the outside, simple in design, but effective in execution. A horizontal bar that slid into an iron bracket. Jack lifted it. The mechanism resisted, metal grinding against metal after years of disuse, then gave way with a screech that was swallowed immediately by the storm. The door swung inward on hinges made of leather that should have rotted to nothing but somehow had not, creaking in protest but holding. The interior was dark, but dry. Unmistakably impossibly dry. Jack stepped inside and pulled the door closed behind him, throwing the latch to secure it against the wind that wanted to tear it open again. The sound of the storm muted immediately, reduced from overwhelming roar to distant presence. He stood still for a long moment, dripping water onto the floor, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness, letting his breath settle into something approaching normal. The silence was profound after the chaos outside. He could hear his own heartbeat, rapid from exertion and cold, could hear the drip of water from his clothing, could hear the faint tick of his watch marking seconds that suddenly mattered again. He unshouldered his pack and set it down carefully, movements deliberate despite the numbness in his fingers. His hands found his headlamp in the side pocket where it always lived, switched it on with stiff fingers that barely responded to commands. The LED beam cut through the darkness like a blade, revealing the space piece by piece, detail by detail. The interior was narrow but efficiently organized, every inch of space utilized with the kind of precision that spoke of someone who understood that waste was death. The wagon's original curvature shaped the room, giving it an elongated feel, but rather than fighting the shape, whoever had built this had embraced it, worked with it, turned limitation into advantage. Along one wall ran a built-in bench with storage beneath it, the lid worn smooth by use that had ended before Jack's grandfather was born. Opposite it stood a small table, folded flat against the wall and secured with a wooden latch that still functioned perfectly. Shelves lined the upper sections of the walls, their contents still visible and somehow intact. Jars, both metal and glass, sealed and waiting. Tools hung from pegs driven into the wall, arranged by size and function in a way that suggested military discipline or its civilian equivalent. A saw, a hammer, chisels of various sizes, all clean and ready for use despite the decades. Nothing was scattered. Nothing suggested panic or haste. Whoever had lived here had maintained order until the very end, had refused to let chaos intrude even when the end was clearly coming. Jack's light found the stove, and he stopped moving. It sat near the center of the structure, positioned carefully to maximize heat distribution while minimizing fire risk. A compact cast iron unit with a flue that rose straight through the roof in a line so vertical, it had to have been measured and remeasured. The metal was dark with age but showed no signs of rust or corrosion that would indicate water intrusion. The design was more sophisticated than he would have expected for a frontier wagon, more sophisticated than many modern wood stoves he had seen. The flue was double-walled where it passed near wooden structural members, insulated in a way that spoke of someone who understood fire and its dangers intimately, who had seen what happened when heat and wood met without proper precautions. He moved closer, crouching despite the protest from his knees, examining it with the attention to detail that had kept him alive in places where inattention meant death. The ash drawer slid out smoothly when he tested it, revealing compacted gray powder that had been dry for longer than he had been alive. The firebox was clean, prepared, left ready for the next fire that never came. The dampers moved when he tested them. Stiff but functional. This stove had been maintained, cared for, treated as the critical piece of survival equipment it represented, then secured properly, then left to wait. As he stood and turned slowly, his light sweeping across the interior, absorbing the space and its implications, something on the table caught the beam. A glass jar larger than the others, positioned in the exact center of the table with a precision that could not be accidental. Under it, pressed flat and protected from moisture and time, was an envelope. Jack crossed to the table and lifted the jar carefully. The envelope beneath was yellowed with age but intact, the paper heavy and substantial, the kind used for documents that were meant to survive. It was sealed with red wax that had cracked in places but had not crumbled entirely. The seal bore an impression he could not make out in the headlamp's beam. And on the front, in handwriting that was both careful and somehow urgent, words that stopped his heart and froze his breath. To the Marine who finds this. Jack stared at the envelope for a long time, while the storm raged outside and the cabin held firm, and the world contracted to this moment, this place, these words. The light from his headlamp illuminated the writing again and again, as if repetition might change the meaning, might make it make sense. It did not. He had served 25 years in the Marine Corps. He wore no uniform now, had not for 9 years, carried no identification that would mark him as a Marine to anyone, let alone to a piece of paper that had been waiting in this forest since before automobiles, before airplanes, before the world learned to kill itself in new and more efficient ways. There was no way anyone could have known, no way anyone could have predicted. To the Marine who finds this, his hands shook as he picked up the envelope, and the shaking had nothing to do with the cold that had seeped into his bones. The wax seal cracked under his thumb, brittle with age. Inside, folded papers, yellowed but legible. He unfolded them with the care usually reserved for handling the flag at a military funeral. The same deliberate slowness, the same sense that what he was holding mattered in ways he did not yet fully understand. The first page was a letter. The ink had faded from black to brown, but the words were clear, the handwriting disciplined and precise. They began simply, without preamble or flowery introduction. If you are reading this, you came when I could not. Jack's breath caught. He read the line again. The handwriting was controlled, the letters formed with the precision of someone who had been taught to write reports under pressure, who understood that clarity could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. His eyes moved down the page. My name is Captain William Brennan, United States Army Corps of Engineers. I served under Colonel James Hartford, Union Army, from 1862 until the war's end. If you bear that name and wear the eagle, globe, and anchor, then you are who I have been waiting for. The headlamp beam wavered. Jack realized his hands were shaking harder now. He set the letter down on the table, pressed his palms flat against the wood, forced himself to breathe. His great-great-grandfather had been James Hartford, Colonel James Hartford. He knew that much from family stories, from the formal photograph that hung in his mother's house, from the brief mentions in Civil War histories that listed his command and his decorations. A colonel in the Union Army, served with distinction, died of natural causes in 1901, buried with full honors in a cemetery outside Washington, D.C. But this letter was addressed to him, to a Marine, to someone named Hartford, who would understand the significance of the eagle, globe, and anchor. He picked up the letter again and continued reading. The colonel saved my life at Antietam. I was pinned under a bridge I had built. My own engineering turned against me when Confederate artillery found its mark. The supports failed. The structure collapsed. I should have died under tons of timber and stone and my own miscalculations. He pulled me out while the structure burned above us, pulled me out when any sane man would have run, when staying meant dying. I owed him my life from that moment forward. I owe his family still. I came west in 1885 with my wife Catherine and our son Thomas. We claimed land here in the Washington Territory, or tried to. The government promised land to veterans who would settle it, who would bring civilization to wilderness. We believed the promise. Catherine fell ill during the journey, a cough that would not stop, blood that appeared when it should not, consumption, tuberculosis. The doctor we found in the last settlement gave her months, perhaps a year, if she was fortunate and rested. We stopped here for winter. I could not continue, could not risk her life on the trail. I used what the Army taught me to turn our wagon into shelter, into something that would keep us alive through the cold months. I built it to save her. I built it strong enough to outlast us both because I am an engineer and I refuse to do anything poorly. Catherine died in the spring of 1886. She is buried 50 meters north of this structure, under a stone I cut and carved myself, in ground that I consecrated with my tears because we had no priest and God had to accept my grief as prayer. I sent Thomas ahead to Seattle with a wagon train that passed through in April. He was 9 years old. I told him I would follow when I had finished my business here. I lied to my son. I have made my peace with that lie. I stayed because I could not leave her alone in this wilderness. I stayed because I had to finish what I started, to document what I had learned, to leave something behind that might help the next man who faces what I faced. This structure, this knowledge, it matters. I documented everything, every measurement, every technique, every lesson learned through trial and error and cold nights when failure meant death. A Marine takes care of his brothers, even across time. The Corps did not exist when I served, but the principles did. We called it something else, but it was the same. Leave no man behind, accomplish the mission, take care of your people. These are not just words. They are how we survive when survival seems impossible. I am dying as I write this. The same sickness that took Catherine has taken residence in my lungs. I can feel it growing, spreading, claiming territory that belongs to me. I have weeks, perhaps days, but I have prepared. Everything you need is here. The stove works if you follow the instructions I carved into the wall above it. The structure will hold if you trust the engineering and do not question what you do not understand. Colonel Hartford promised me that his family would never forget the debt between us, that his blood would honor what he owed me. I never asked him to repay it. I never wanted anything from him except his friendship, which he gave freely. But I am asking now. I am calling in the debt across decades and distance. Tell my son, if he still lives, if he can be found, that I did not abandon him. Tell him I stayed to honor his mother and to create something that matters, something that outlasts flesh and breath and grief. Tell him I thought of him every day, that every measurement I took and every note I made was for him, so he would know that his father was not just a deserter or a fool. If a Hartford finds this, the circle is complete. If a Marine finds this, the brotherhood endures. Do your duty as I have done mine. Captain William Brennan, United States Army Corps of Engineers, December 1889. Jack Hartford stood in a cabin built before the modern world, before electricity and internal combustion and all the conveniences that made survival seem automatic. He stood in a place where a brother in arms had waited more than 130 years to deliver a message to someone who shared his blood and his code, in his understanding that some debts transcend death itself. Outside, the storm hammered the forest with mindless fury, wind and rain conspiring to destroy what could be destroyed. Inside, a man who had not cried since the day they lowered his wife into the ground felt something crack behind his ribs, a fissure opening in defenses he had thought were permanent. He folded the letter carefully, precisely, and placed it back on the table. Then he removed his wet jacket, hung it on a peg that had been waiting since Grover Cleveland was president, and began to search the cabin for the rest of Captain William Brennan's story, for the duty that had been passed to him across a century and change. The night had just begun, and Jack Hartford, United States Marine Corps, retired, understood with perfect clarity that he had not stumbled into this place by accident or chance. Lisa had known. Somehow, impossibly, she had known. She had sent him here with her dying request, had pointed him toward this trail, toward this storm, toward this moment. And now it was his turn to find out why. Now it was his turn to honor the debt that had been waiting, patient and implacable, for someone with the right name and the right heart to finally come home. Jack stood motionless in the center of the cabin for a long time after reading Captain Brennan's letter, the paper still in his hands, the words still burning in his mind like phosphorus that would not stop smoldering no matter how much you smothered it. The storm outside had intensified, wind hammering the walls with fists of air and rain that should have torn the structure apart. But the cabin held without complaint, without even the suggestion of weakness. Every joint, every board, every carefully calculated angle absorbed the violence and dispersed it through the frame, turned chaos into manageable force the way good engineering always did. Whoever had built this place had understood not just carpentry, but physics, had known that survival was mathematics made solid, that the difference between standing and falling was measured in degrees of angle and depths of foundation. He set the letter down on the table with reverence, usually reserved for sacred objects, for folded flags and handwritten wills, and began a methodical examination of the cabin with the eyes of someone who had spent 25 years looking at structures and determining whether they would kill the men who trusted them. The headlamp beam swept across every surface, cataloging details his conscious mind had missed in the initial shock of discovery and the urgency of escape from weather. This was no crude frontier shelter thrown together in desperation by someone hoping to survive one winter. This was engineering at a level that would have impressed his instructors at the Marine Corps School of Engineers, men who had spent careers building in combat zones and teaching others to do the same. The walls were double layered as he had initially observed, but the sophistication became clear only on closer inspection with the benefit of light and time and focus. The outer layer consisted of logs fitted with precision that would have required significant skill and patience, their surfaces adzed flat where they met to create tight seals that left no gaps for wind or water. The inner layer was planking, thinner and more regular, obviously milled rather than hewn, creating an air gap of approximately 4 inches between the two surfaces. That gap would have been filled with insulating material, probably moss or dried grass harvested locally and packed tight enough to prevent settling, but loose enough to trap air. The principle was sound, identical to modern construction techniques used to break thermal bridging and prevent heat loss through solid materials. Someone in 1885 had understood heat transfer without the benefit of textbooks or formal training, had worked it out through observation and experimentation in the ruthless teacher that was winter in the Pacific Northwest. The roof structure revealed similar thoughtfulness when Jack examined it systematically. Rafters were sized appropriately for the span and the snow load they would inevitably bear. Not oversized wastefully, but not undersized dangerously. They were spaced at intervals that balanced material efficiency with strength requirements. Probably 16 inches on center, though he would need daylight and a tape measure to verify. The pitch was steep enough to shed precipitation efficiently, but not so steep that construction would have been impossible for a single man working alone without scaffolding or mechanical advantage. Shingles were hand-split cedar, overlapped in a pattern that created multiple water barriers through successive layers. Even after more than a century exposed to weather that could strip paint from steel and rot pressure-treated lumber, they remained largely intact, a testament to both material selection and installation technique. Jack moved to the stove and examined it more closely in the better light provided by his headlamp and the growing familiarity with the space. Cast iron, compact but heavy, probably weighing close to 300 pounds when fully assembled. It would have been manufactured somewhere back east, Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, then transported across a continent at great expense and effort, every mile adding costs that most frontier families could not afford. The fact that it existed here suggested either wealth or priority, a decision to spend resources on proven technology rather than improvising with stones and mud. The flue pipe was double-walled where it penetrated the roof structure, with an air gap and metal shielding that prevented heat transfer to combustible materials. Modern building codes would approve of the installation without reservation. More than approve, they would use it as an example of best practice. Whoever had designed this had either seen buildings burn because of poor flue installation or had studied under someone who understood that fire was tool and weapon both, useful only when properly contained. Above the stove, carved directly into the wall planking with what must have been a knife or narrow chisel, were instructions written in the same careful hand that had penned the letter on the table. Jack read them slowly, his engineering mind translating 19th century language into modern principles, recognizing in each line the voice of hard-won experience. When wind comes from west, close lower damper half to prevent backdraft. When from east, open full to aid draw. When storm brings pressure low as it does before snow, crack door at base 1 inch to aid draft when flue struggles. When fire burns reluctant and smoke fills room, check flue cap for ice formation or bird nest. Wood burns hot and fast, suitable for cooking and quick warmth. Coal burns slow and steady, suitable for overnight when sleep is needed and tending is impossible. Never sleep with damper closed full, or the morning will not come and you will not wake at all. The instructions continued for several more lines, each one a lesson learned through experience, through cold nights when failure meant death, through trial and error when error carried permanent consequences. Jack recognized the voice of someone teaching a student who was not present, someone documenting knowledge because written words outlasted memory and flesh, because the next person to need this information might arrive desperate and frozen and unable to learn through mistakes. He found more writings on other surfaces as he explored systematically, moving clockwise around the interior space. Notes about water collection, specific locations where runoff could be caught in containers during rain, where snow could be melted efficiently in winter. Notes about food storage, which preserved goods could be trusted after months of storage and which would betray you with subtle spoilage. Notes about structural maintenance, which joints needed checking after heavy snow, which seams required recalking each spring. Every observation was practical, stripped of sentiment, focused entirely on the business of survival. This was a technical manual written by someone who understood that the next occupant might arrive desperate and unprepared. That clear instructions could mean the difference between living and dying in wilderness, that cared nothing for good intentions. The shelves along the walls held supplies that had been carefully preserved and organized with the same precision that characterized everything else in the space. Glass jars contained dried goods, their contents still identifiable despite the decades of storage. Beans, rice, flour sealed against moisture, and vermin with wax and cloth covers. Metal tins held items less vulnerable to time, sugar, and salt, and spices that would have been luxuries on the frontier. Tools were arranged with military precision, each one cleaned and oiled before storage, ready for immediate use by someone who might need them urgently. Nothing was left to chance or assumption. Jack opened the storage bench beneath the sleeping platform and found blankets that had once been wool, but had finally surrendered to time and insects and the slow work of decay. They crumbled to dust at his touch, their fibers separating into individual threads that floated in the headlamp beam like snow. Beneath them were items wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them better, creating barriers that moths and moisture could not easily penetrate. He unwrapped each bundle carefully, documenting what Brennan had chosen to preserve against all eventualities. A Bible, leather-bound and well-used, the binding cracked from repeated opening, the pages soft with handling. Inside the front cover were handwritten names in permanent ink on permanent paper. William Brennan married to Catherine Morrison, 1880. Thomas William Brennan, born 1876, Philadelphia. The dates recorded in careful script that suggested permanence, family history preserved because it mattered. because someone might need to know who these people had been before the wilderness claimed them. A leather journal, its cover stained and worn, its pages filled with entries dating from September 1885 through December 1889. Jack opened it carefully, aware that he was holding something fragile and irreplaceable, something that should be in an archive under glass rather than in his hands in a storm-soaked cabin in the middle of nowhere. The first entry was dated September 1885, written in strong, confident hand that showed no hesitation or doubt. We have stopped at what I believe to be the coordinates promised in the land claim documentation provided by Colonel Hartford. The country is heavily forested with Douglas fir and western cedar, dense enough to block sunlight at ground level, but not impassable to determine travel. Water is abundant, multiple streams within a quarter-mile. Game appears plentiful, though I am no hunter and will need to learn those skills or do without meat. Catherine's condition has worsened during the journey. The cough that began in St. Louis has deepened, and blood now appears with increasing frequency. The doctor in Olympia examined her and gave me medicines that do nothing but ease discomfort temporarily. I will build shelter here and pray for winter to bring improvement that summer did not. Jack read forward, watching as optimism gave way to pragmatism, as Brennan documented the construction of the cabin in entries that became increasingly technical and decreasingly personal. He described the process of selecting trees for cutting, choosing specimens that were straight and free of rot, felling them with a two-man saw operated alone through back-breaking effort. He documented the technique of trimming branches and bark, of notching logs to fit together tightly, of raising walls through leverage and persistence when muscle alone was insufficient. The entries were detailed enough that someone with basic tools and knowledge could replicate the work, could build their own version of the shelter using the same principles. That was clearly intentional. Brennan was not just recording his own work, he was teaching across time, leaving instructions for students he would never meet. Catherine's condition appeared in the entries with decreasing frequency and increasing brevity, as if Brennan could not bear to document her decline in detail, could not put into words what was happening to the woman he had promised to protect. Small mentions scattered through technical observations. Catherine ate soup today, kept it down. Catherine walked to the stream to wash, returned exhausted. Catherine coughed blood again, more than yesterday, the color darker. The progression was clear, even in its understatement. The story told through what was not said as much as what was. Then an entry from April 14, 1886, that stopped Jack's breath and made him sit down heavily on the bench. Catherine passed this morning as the sun rose over the ridge to the east. She woke, looked at me with clarity she had not shown in weeks, smiled, and died. She did not suffer at the end, or if she did, she hid it from me as she hid so much of her pain. I have buried her on the small rise to the north where wildflowers grow in spring, where she liked to sit when she had strength to walk that far. I carved her name in stone because wood will rot eventually, and she deserves permanence. Thomas does not understand what has happened. He knows his mother is gone, but cannot grasp that she will not return. He is 9. How can he understand what I barely comprehend myself? I told him she is with God now and will watch over him. He asked if that meant she was in the ground or in the sky. I had no answer. The handwriting on that entry was less controlled than previous ones, the letters varying in size and pressure. Evidence of grief breaking through discipline, emotion overcoming the engineering precision that characterized everything else Brennan had written. Jack recognized the pattern because he had created it himself in his own journal after Lisa died, trying to contain in ink and paper emotions that had no container, trying to make sense of loss that had no sense to be made. He had written about the moment Lisa stopped breathing, about the way her hand had gone still in his, about the sound the machines made when they registered the absence of heartbeat. He had documented it with the same clinical precision Brennan had used, because precision was control and control was survival, and anything else meant drowning in grief that had no bottom. Subsequent entries detailed Brennan's decision to send Thomas away with a wagon train heading to Seattle. The reasoning was clear and heartbreaking in its ruthless logic. Winter was coming again, and with it the killing cold that measured survival in quart of wood and pounds of food. Supplies were limited despite careful rationing. Brennan's own health was failing. The same cough that had killed Catherine now establishing itself in his lungs with grim familiarity and inevitable progression. He could hear the rattle when he breathed deep, could taste copper when he coughed hard, could feel the tightness in his chest that would only worsen. The mathematics were simple and terrible in their clarity. Keeping the boy here meant condemning him to watch his father die slowly over months, then face wilderness alone at 9 years old with winter closing in and no knowledge of how to survive. Sending him away meant a chance at life, a possibility of future, even if that future held no father and no home and no certainty. The entries documenting Thomas's departure were the hardest to read, each word a small knife. Brennan recorded every detail with clinical precision, as if by documenting the process he could somehow justify it to himself, or to history, or to the son who would hate him for it. I told Thomas he was going to a better place where there would be other children and warm meals and schools that would teach him to read better than I can teach him here. He asked why I was not coming with him if this new place was so much better than where we are. I told him I would follow when my work here was complete, when I had finished documenting the cabin's construction and secured the land claim. He asked what work could be more important than staying with him. I had no answer that would satisfy a 9-year-old child. Logic does not comfort the young. Reason is no substitute for presence. I told him I loved him and that everything I do is for him. He asked if that meant I was sending him away because I did not want him. The question broke something in me that I did not know could break. I held him until he stopped crying. It solved nothing, but I had nothing else to offer. No words adequate to the task. No explanation that would make sense to a boy who had already lost his mother and now was losing his father. The wagon master agreed to take Thomas to Seattle and deliver him to the address I provided, the home of a minister named Reverend John Chapman, who runs an organization that helps orphans and displaced children find placement. I paid him everything I had left of value. Catherine's jewelry, modest but real silver and genuine stones. The coins we had saved over years of careful economy. All of it went to ensure Thomas's safe passage. The wagon master looked at me with pity when I handed over the purse, and I hated him for it with an intensity that surprised me. But he took the boy and promised to see him safe to the address. That is all I can ask. That in prayer to a God who has not answered me yet but might still be listening. Thomas looked back as the wagon pulled away down the trail toward the main road. I raised my hand in farewell, tried to smile so that would be his last image of me. He did not wave back. He simply stared with eyes that accused me of betrayal he could not articulate. He will hate me for this someday when he is old enough to understand that I sent him away. That is acceptable. Hate means he lived long enough to remember me. Indifference would mean he forgot or died. I can live with his hate if it means he lives. That is all that matters now. Jack had to stop writing. His vision had blurred and his chest felt constricted in a way that had nothing to do with altitude or exertion or the cold that still lingered despite the stove's heat. He stood and walked to the small window, looking out at darkness and rain, and seeing nothing but his own reflection in the glass, and behind it the ghost of every goodbye he had ever said to his own sons. Daniel at 9 years old crying when Jack deployed to Iraq the first time, asking why Daddy had to go away when he had promised to take him camping. Michael at 7 holding Lisa's hand and not understanding why his father chose to leave when he could have chosen to stay. Both of them growing up in snapshots and phone calls and video chats that buffered over bad connections. Growing up with a father who was present in theory, but absent in fact. Jack had justified it the same way Brennan had justified it, with the logic of duty and necessity. Someone had to go. He had the skills. The mission mattered. The country needed him. All true statements that added up to the same result. His sons grew up without him, learned to stop asking when he would be home, learned to expect disappointment and accommodate absence. He had told himself it was different because he came back, because he was not dying, because the separations were temporary. But standing in a cabin built by a man who had sent his son away to save his life, Jack could no longer quite believe his own rationalizations. Absence was absence. Loss was loss. The mechanism that separated father from son operated the same whether driven by disease or duty. The journal continued through the months after Thomas left, and Jack forced himself to keep reading despite the pain it caused. Brennan's entries became less frequent as his health declined, his handwriting occasionally shaky, evidence of fever or weakness or the simple exhaustion that came from fighting a losing battle against biology. But the technical observations never wavered. He documented modifications to the cabin with the same care he had used when building it. Improvements to the stove system that increased efficiency, notes about weather patterns and their effects on the structure, observations about wind loading and snow accumulation, and the constant maintenance required to keep the forest from reclaiming what he had built. This was a man who refused to waste the time he had left, who chose to be useful until the very end, who understood that his life might be ending, but his work could continue if properly documented. October 1887. The consumption progresses as expected. I cough blood most mornings now. My strength wanes steadily. I estimate I have months remaining, perhaps a year if I am fortunate, though I am not certain fortune is measured in prolonged dying. I have written letters to Thomas, care of Reverend Chapman, but received no reply. Either they do not reach him or he chooses not to respond. Both possibilities pain me, but I understand either. I continue to document everything I can about this structure and its construction. If I cannot leave my son money or land or any material advantage, perhaps I can leave knowledge that someone will find useful. December 1888. Received word through a passing trapper that Reverend Chapman died 2 years ago. His organization disbanded. No record of what became of the children in his care. I have no way to locate Thomas, no means to determine if he lives or has perished. This not knowing is worse than confirmation of death would be. I pray he survived and is well, that some family took him in and gave him the life I could not provide. I pray, but I do not know if my prayers reach any destination. March 1889. The winter was harder than previous years. I barely survived it. The cabin held perfectly as I knew it would. The engineering is sound, but I am not. I can no longer walk to the stream without resting. I cannot split wood without becoming breathless. I am dying in increments, losing function and capacity day by day. I have begun to prepare this place for whoever finds it next. Organizing supplies, writing instructions, leaving everything in order because disorder is a kind of death in itself. Jack found the entry he had been looking for near the end of the journal. Dated November 1889, the handwriting noticeably shakier than earlier entries. The consumption has me now completely as it had Catherine. I can feel it in my chest, the same tightness, the same fluid, the same blood when I cough. I have weeks at most, perhaps less. I have spent these final days organizing everything, writing instructions for cabin maintenance, preparing this place for whoever finds it next. I do not know if Thomas still lives. I do not know if my letters ever reached him in whatever place he was taken after Reverend Chapman died. I do not know if the Hartford family remembers the debt Colonel Hartford spoke of so earnestly, but I have done what I can. The cabin will stand for decades, perhaps longer. The knowledge will endure if someone finds it. That must be enough. I cannot do more. There was a gap of several pages, then one final entry in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. Letters wandering across the page as if written by someone whose hand no longer fully obeyed commands. To whoever finds this, I served my country in the war that nearly destroyed it. I honored my wife as best I could with the tools and knowledge I possessed. I tried to save my son by sending him away, and I do not know if that choice was mercy or cruelty. I built this place to outlast me because engineering is the only immortality I understand, the only way to leave something behind that matters. Use it well. Trust the mathematics. Check the stove dampers. Colonel Hartford, if your blood finds this, tell them William Brennan kept faith with the promises he made, even when keeping them meant dying alone. Tell them I remembered. The entry was dated December 8, 1889. There was nothing after it. No final goodbye. No summation of a life. No last words of wisdom. Just silence and the implication of death that came sometime after that date, alone in a cabin in a forest where no one came. Jack sat on the bench and let the journal rest on his knees while the storm raged outside, and the cabin held, and the ghost of Captain William Brennan seemed to occupy the same space he did, separated by time but joined by understanding so complete it was almost communion. A man who had chosen duty over comfort, who had built something that mattered, who had died alone because the alternative was watching his son die. A man who had documented everything because knowledge outlasted flesh, who had trusted that someone would find his work and understand his value. It was then, sitting in the near dark with only his headlamp for illumination, that Jack noticed the metal box tucked beneath the bench in a space he had initially missed. It was military issue, stamped with markings that dated it to the Civil War era. He pulled it out carefully and set it on the table. The box was substantial, made to protect documents from water and fire, made to survive when everything else burned. The box was locked, but the key hung on a nail directly above it on the wall. Another example of Brennan's methodical preparation. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. Jack unlocked the box and lifted the lid with hands that trembled slightly. Inside, arranged with the same precision that characterized everything else in the cabin, were documents that made his heart hammer in his chest hard enough that he could feel the pulse in his throat. Service records on official paper. Discharge certificates bearing stamps and signatures. Letters on military stationery that carried the weight of authority. Captain William Brennan, United States Army Corps of Engineers. Enlisted June 1862 as private. Promoted to corporal September 1862 for distinguished service at Antietam. Commissioned as officer rank March 1863 for actions at Fredericksburg, where he constructed emergency fortifications under fire that saved the lives of an entire company. Assigned to the Army of the Potomac, Corps of Engineers, under direct command of Colonel James Hartford, Jack's great-great-grandfather. The connection confirmed in official records that could not be dismissed as family legend or misremembered story. He had known it from Brennan's letter, but seeing it documented in military records made it real in a way that personal testimony had not. He lifted out the service record and found beneath it a collection of letters, still in their original envelopes, organized by date with the same care Brennan had applied to everything. The earliest was dated October 1862, written on paper so brittle it threatened to crumble at touch. Jack unfolded it with infinite care, aware that he was handling history, that these words had been written when the outcome of the war was still uncertain and death was common enough to lose its horror. Captain Brennan, I write to commend your actions at Antietam, where you distinguished yourself beyond measure. Your engineering of the temporary bridge across Antietam Creek under sustained fire saved countless lives and allowed the advance to continue when all other crossings had been destroyed or denied. When the structure failed due to concentrated enemy artillery finding its mark, your courage in remaining beneath the collapsing timbers to extract wounded men was noted by all present and will be reflected in official commendation. I am alive because you did not abandon me when prudence and self-preservation suggested immediate retreat. That debt will not be forgotten. You have my gratitude and my friendship for as long as I draw breath. The letter was signed by Colonel James Hartford and bore the official seal of his command, pressed into wax that had survived more than a century. There were more letters, spanning the years of the war and continuing after. Correspondence between two soldiers who had become brothers through shared danger and mutual respect. The colonel checking on Brennan after battles, after the war ended, offering assistance with finding employment, providing letters of recommendation for positions in civilian engineering. Brennan politely declining most help but maintaining the connection, writing back with updates on his life, his marriage to Catherine, the birth of Thomas, plans to claim Western land. The letters painted a picture of two men who respected each other completely, who had forged a bond in circumstances that stripped away pretense and revealed character. The colonel writing as an equal despite the difference in rank. Brennan responding with affection and humor despite the formality required by military courtesy. The final letter from the colonel was dated March 1884, a year before Brennan headed west with his family. William, I have purchased the land claim you mentioned in the Washington Territory. It is registered in your name through proper legal channels, payment rendered in full through funds I consider well spent. Please consider this a small return on a debt I can never truly repay. You saved my life at Antietam when any sensible man would have fled. You have refused my offers of help repeatedly with a stubbornness I recognize because I share it. But I will not be refused in this. Build your new life on that land. Raise your son Thomas in clean air, an open country far from the smoke of cities and the noise of industry. Give him the childhood we missed in our generation. And know that whatever you need, my family will provide. This I promise you as I promise it to mine. The Hartfords do not forget debts or friends, We keep faith with those who kept faith with us. If I do not live to see you again, know that my sons and their sons will honor what I owe. Your service, your courage, your friendship. None of it will be forgotten. The letter was signed with obvious affection and sealed with the Hartford family crest pressed into red wax. Jack read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new implications and deeper meaning. His great-great-grandfather had bought this land for Brennan as repayment for a life debt incurred in battle, had ensured the claim was legal and paid in full, had created a bond that extended beyond the 2 men to their families, a promise meant to span generations. A promise that had somehow been lost or forgotten as those generations passed and the specific debt faded from memory into a vague family story. But somewhere in the transmission of history from father to son to grandson, the details had been lost. Jack's father had never mentioned William Brennan. His grandfather had died young, taking whatever stories he knew to a grave in Arlington. The connection had frayed with time and distance, then broken, then disappeared entirely into the silence that claims all things eventually. Until now. Until a storm and a lost trail in a cabin that had waited patiently for more than a century for someone with the right name and the right understanding to finally find it. Jack pulled out the remaining items from the box with hands that shook from cold and emotion in equal measure. A medal, tarnished but intact, awarded for valor at the Battle of Antietam. The ribbon faded to almost colorless, but the bronze star still clearly engraved. A photograph, faded to sepia tones, showing 2 men in Union uniforms standing before a partially constructed pontoon bridge. One was clearly younger, dark-haired and serious, his face lean with the hardness that came from sustained campaign. The other was older, gray, showing in his beard, hand resting on the younger man's shoulder in a gesture of affection and respect. On the back, written in pencil that had somehow survived when ink would have faded, Colonel James Hartford and Captain William Brennan. Rappahannock River, May 1863. The younger man was Brennan. The older was Jack's great-great-grandfather, the colonel whose promise had brought Jack here across more than a century. He stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the face with the stories he had been told as a child, with the formal portrait that hung in his mother's house showing a stern old man in full-dress uniform. This man looked tired and real and human, not posed and distant. This man looked like someone who kept promises and meant them. Beneath the photograph were more documents, each one adding weight to the story. The land deed for this property, legally registered in Brennan's name, with notation that purchase price had been paid in full by Colonel James Hartford as a gift requiring no repayment. Letters of credit from the Hartford Family Bank, never used. Amounts left blank to be filled in at need. Evidence of a promise kept even when the person who had made it had died. And finally, at the very bottom of the box, an envelope sealed with wax and marked with a single word in the colonel's handwriting, Hartford. Jack broke the seal with his thumbnail and pulled out the letter inside. It was from Colonel Hartford, written in 1900, the year before his death, according to the date at the top. The handwriting was shaky, an old man's hands struggling to form letters that had once come easily. To my children and to their children and to all who bear the Hartford name in generations I will not live to see, I leave this final instruction and charge. William Brennan of Philadelphia, captain in the Army Corps of Engineers, saved my life at Antietam when I was pinned beneath a bridge that collapsed under artillery fire. He pulled me from certain death when any reasonable man would have fled to save himself. I owe him my life and everything that came after it, including you who read this now. I purchased land for him in the Washington Territory where he intended to build a new life with his wife Catherine and his son Thomas. I have not heard from him in 15 years, and my attempts to locate him have failed. I fear he may have perished in the wilderness or that some misfortune has befallen his family. If any of you should encounter news of his fate or of his descendants, I ask and require that you honor the debt I owe. Render whatever assistance is required without question or hesitation. The Hartford name means something in this world because we keep faith with those who kept faith with us. Let that not change. Let that be your inheritance from me along with whatever money or property I leave behind. Honor and faith matter more than wealth. Promise me you will remember. The letter was signed in a hand so shaky it was almost illegible. A dying man's final instruction to family he would not see grow old. Jack folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. then sat with his head in his hands while the full weight of discovery settled over him like snow. He was reading his great-great-grandfather's last wishes, instructions that had never been followed because they had been locked in a box in a cabin in a forest where no Hartford had come, where the connection had been lost to time and distance, and the simple fact that nobody alive knew to look, until Lisa. Somehow Lisa had known, or suspected, or researched, deep enough to find traces of the story. She had found this cabin and the letters and the connection before the cancer took her. And she had left breadcrumbs for Jack to follow, had sent him here with her dying words because she understood that some things could not be given as gifts, only earned through experience and discovery. Find what I found there, she had said. She had found this. She had found the debt unpaid and the promise unkept and the circle waiting to be closed. And she had trusted him to finish what she started. The storm outside reached a new level of fury. Wind screamed through the trees with a sound like sustained artillery fire, like incoming mortars, like all the violence Jack had ever heard compressed into atmospheric pressure and water. Rain hammered the roof in waves that had suggested the sky had given up on individual drops and committed to sheets of water that would strip flesh from bone if you stood in them long enough. Lightning flashed somewhere close, the thunder following almost immediately with force that shook the ground. But the cabin absorbed it all, the engineering sound, the mathematics holding against chaos, Brennan's careful work proving itself against nature's best effort to destroy it. Jack rose and moved to the stove because he needed heat, needed work, needed to ground himself in physical reality, while his mind tried to process emotional impossibility. The fire had burned down to coals during his reading. He opened the firebox and added wood from the stack against the wall, aging cedar that had been protected from moisture and was still dry enough to catch. He followed Brennan's instructions exactly, adjusting dampers according to wind direction, cracking the door at the base to aid draft as the carved notes directed. When the new fuel caught and began to burn steadily, heat bloomed from the cast iron with increasing intensity. He hung his still damp outer layers on pegs that Brennan had placed for exactly this purpose, positioning them where heat would reach but not close enough to scorch or ignite. He changed into dry base layers from his pack, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a familiar drill perfected through repetition. Then he sat on the bench with the journal and began to read the remaining entries in earnest, absorbing not just the words but the man behind them, the engineer who had built something permanent in a world that promised nothing permanent. The night deepened beyond the walls. The storm continued its assault without pause or mercy, wind and rain, and occasional thunder that suggested the weather system had settled in for duration. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the careful work of a dead engineer, Jack Hartford read the story of a man who had faced impossible choices and made them anyway, who had built something that mattered when nothing seemed to matter, who had kept faith with the absent and the dead because faith was all he had left. He read until his eyes burned, until the words began to blur, until exhaustion and emotional overload finally overwhelmed the adrenaline that had kept him alert through crisis and discovery. The fire in the stove settled into a steady glow, maintaining heat without requiring constant attention. The wind outside diminished slightly as the storm paused to gather strength for another push. Jack stretched out on the bench with his pack as a pillow, exactly as Brennan must have done countless times, and stared at the ceiling that had been built with ends that were dust now. The joinery was visible, even in the dimness beyond his headlamp beam. The careful fitting of boards, the spacing of supports calculated to bear load without wasting material. Everything done right because doing it wrong meant failure, and failure meant death. He thought about the letter he would need to write when he got back to civilization, the phone calls he would need to make, the search he would need to begin for Thomas Brennan's descendants if any existed. The duty that had been passed to him across generations and waited patiently for someone to accept it and carry it forward. Brennan had asked for one thing: tell Thomas. Tell him I did not abandon him. Tell him everything I did was for him. That promise needed to be kept even if it took years to find the people who needed to hear it. Colonel Hartford had promised that his family would honor the debt. Jack would keep that promise because Marines kept their word and Hartfords kept their word, and some debts transcended death itself. Outside, the storm renewed its fury one final time, throwing everything it had against the walls that had stood for more than a century. Inside, two Marines separated by time but joined by code shared the same space in a way that felt less metaphorical than real. The cabin held because Brennan had built it to hold. And Jack Hartford slept his first sound sleep in 8 months because he had finally found something that mattered enough to wake for. A purpose that justified the continued effort of living. Morning would bring decisions and plans and the long work of closing circles that had been open too long. But for now, in the depth of night, with the storm at its peak and the fire burning steady, there was only rest and the quiet understanding that duty was not burden, but gift, not sacrifice, but meaning. The wagon had stopped rolling more than a century ago, its wheels sunk into earth that would not release them. But its work was not finished. Not yet. And neither was his. Jack woke to silence that felt wrong after the violence of the storm. A quiet so complete it seemed artificial, as if the world had ended during the night, and he was the only thing left breathing. His internal clock, calibrated by decades of military discipline and reinforced by a lifetime of early rises that could not be unlearned, told him it was near dawn, though no light penetrated the cabin's small window yet. The darkness outside was absolute, the kind that exists only in wilderness far from human light, the kind that reminded you how small you were and how indifferent the universe remained to your existence. The fire in the stove had burned down to ash and a few stubborn coals that glowed faintly red when he cracked open the door, remnants of heat fighting against the cold that had seeped back into the cabin during the hours he slept. Outside, the world was utterly still, that profound quiet that follows great storms when the air itself seems exhausted from the effort of fury, when even the trees seem to hold their breath, waiting to see what damage has been done. He sat up slowly, carefully, joints protesting the night spent on a wooden bench that had been designed more for brief sitting than extended sleeping. His back ached in ways that reminded him he was not 25 anymore, that the body kept meticulous score of every poor decision even when the mind tried to ignore the accounting. His right shoulder clicked when he rolled it, that familiar sound that meant weather was changing or he had slept wrong or both. His knees complained when he stood, speaking their daily language of wear and old injuries that had healed but never quite forgotten. But he had slept, actually slept, deeply and without interruption, for the first time since Lisa died 8 months ago, without waking every hour to reach across the bed for her absence, without startling awake from dreams where she was still alive and smiling and the cancer had never happened. The cabin had given him that, if nothing else, had wrapped him in the careful engineering of a dead man and let him rest in a way his own house never did. He rekindled the fire using the technique Brennan had documented on the wall, adding small pieces of dry wood to the coals in a specific pattern that maximized airflow, adjusting the dampers to precisely the position the carved instructions indicated, watching as flame returned with willing cooperation born of good design. The stove warmed quickly, cast iron radiating heat that pushed back against the cold, and he stood close to it while he packed his gear and prepared mentally for whatever the day would bring. His original plan, hiking the remaining miles back to the trailhead and his truck, was clearly impossible now. The storm would have destroyed what remained of an already marginal trail, would have turned every low spot into a creek and every gentle slope into a mudslide waiting to catch the unwary. Fallen trees would block the path in dozens of places. Washouts would have erased the route entirely in sections where water concentrated its flow. He would be here at least another day, possibly 2 or 3, depending on how bad the damage was, waiting for the Forest Service to clear emergency routes or for search and rescue to find him. That was acceptable. More than acceptable. There was work to be done here, duty to be performed, promises to be honored and understood. The cabin had waited more than a century for a Hartford to find it, had held its secrets through generations of storms and seasons, and the slow, patient work of forest reclaiming what humans abandoned. Another day or two would not matter in the scheme of that waiting. He ate a cold breakfast from his pack while standing at the window watching darkness give way to gray pre-dawn light. Protein bars that tasted like cardboard and dried fruit that required serious chewing. Food chosen for caloric density rather than pleasure. The kind of utilitarian eating that had sustained him through countless field exercises and deployments. He chased it with water from his bladder, now refilled from the stream Brennan had noted in his journal as reliable and pure. Then he checked his radio, powering it on and scanning channels for any signal. Static answered him, white noise broken by occasional pops and hisses, but no human voice, no rescue frequency acknowledging his position. He had expected that. The valley was deep, surrounded by ridges that rose hundreds of feet on all sides, creating a natural bowl that blocked radio transmission effectively. He would need to climb to higher ground to call for help, to let someone know he was alive and where he was. But that could wait. First, there were things he needed to see, confirmations he needed to make, evidence he needed to document for purposes that were not yet entirely clear but felt essential. Brennan's journal had mentioned Catherine's grave, 50 meters north of the cabin on a small rise where wildflowers grew in spring. Jack pulled on his jacket, still damp from yesterday's storm, but warmer than nothing, shouldered a light pack with his camera and GPS unit and emergency supplies, and stepped outside into a world that had been fundamentally rearranged by water and wind and the forces that shaped wilderness without asking permission. The forest looked like a battlefield after artillery had found its range. Trees down everywhere in chaotic patterns, some snapped at mid-height where the wind had found weaknesses in their structure, areas of rot or damage that had been invisible from ground level but were catastrophic underloading. Others had been uprooted entirely. Massive root balls taller than a man thrust upward from soil too saturated to hold them, earth clinging to the roots like evidence of violence. Branches covered the ground in overlapping layers, making walking treacherous, every step requiring attention to avoid turning an ankle or worse. The cabin sat in the center of a small clearing that had been expanded dramatically by the storm, trees falling outward in a rough circle, as if the structure had protected itself by sacrificing the perimeter, as if Brennan's engineering had created an invisible shield that deflected wind around the walls rather than through them. Jack stood looking at it with the eye of someone who had spent a career assessing structural integrity under load and found himself impressed despite everything. Not a shingle missing from the roof, not a board split or displaced. The door hung exactly as it had, the walls stood plumb and true, the whole structure radiating solidity that modern construction built to minimum code could not match. This was what happened when a man built not for profit or convenience or to satisfy some inspector's checklist, but for survival, when failure meant death and success meant only the opportunity to face another day. Brennan had over-engineered everything deliberately, had built in redundancy and margins that seemed excessive until you realized they were the difference between standing and collapse. Jack oriented himself using the compass function on his GPS, determined which direction was north, and began to search systematically. The ground was soft from the rain, his boots sinking inches with each step, mud sucking at the soles with the distinctive sound of saturated earth reluctantly releasing its grip. Water stood in depressions everywhere, pooled in places where yesterday there had been solid ground. Fallen branches forced constant detours. But he moved methodically, using search techniques that had been drilled into him during training that felt like it had happened to someone else in a different lifetime. He found the first grave 20 minutes later, after systematically covering the likely area. Exactly where Brennan had said it would be, though the landmarks had changed enough that finding it required patience. A small rise that would catch sunlight and shed water, where soil was probably better, and wildflowers would grow when spring came, if they grew anywhere in this dense forest. The headstone was rough granite, clearly hand-cut with tools that left visible marks, with letters carved deep enough to survive more than a century of weathering and erosion. Catherine Morrison Brennan, born 1858, died April 14, 1886. Beloved wife and mother, age 28. The dates made Jack pause. 28 years old when she died. Younger than both his sons were now. A whole life unlived, all the years that should have followed compressed into nothing by disease that modern medicine could cure with antibiotics, but that frontier medicine could only watch helplessly. She had been younger than Lisa when the cancer took her at 56, had lost even more time to illness, that cared nothing for fairness or justice, or the fact that a 9-year-old boy needed his mother. Jack stood before the grave with his hat in his hands, though he had not removed his hat for anyone in years, not since military funerals where protocol required it. The gesture felt appropriate here, necessary, a small acknowledgement of the woman who had died in wilderness for the promise of something better, who had trusted her husband to build shelter that failed to save her from disease that shelter could not prevent. He took photographs from multiple angles, documented the inscription and the location with GPS coordinates that would let him find this place again or guide others to it, then continued searching because Brennan had mentioned his own grave and Jack needed to see it, needed to confirm what he already knew. He found William Brennan's grave 10 meters west of Catherine's, placed with the same care, oriented the same direction, part of a family plot that had been planned even if the family it served had been destroyed before the plan could be completed. The stone was similar in size and style, hand-cut from the same granite outcrop Brennan must have identified nearby. Letters carved with the same careful depth by hands that knew their work was permanent. Captain William Brennan, born 1840, died December 1889, United States Army Corps of Engineers, faithful unto death. The phrase made Jack's throat tighten and his eyes burn despite the cold wind that had picked up with the sunrise. Faithful unto death. Brennan had carved his own headstone, had selected the words that would mark his grave for however long stone endured, had prepared his own burial marker, knowing he would die alone with no one to perform the service or speak the words that mattered. That level of self-sufficiency and acceptance of isolation was almost incomprehensible to Jack, who had lived his entire adult life surrounded by other Marines, part of a system that promised you were never alone, even when you died. But Brennan had been alone, completely alone in the last months, the last weeks, the last days and hours. Coughing blood and feeling his strength fade, knowing what was coming because he had watched it take Catherine, had nursed her through the same decline he was now experiencing himself. And through it all he had documented, had written instructions, had carved notes into wood, had prepared the cabin for the next person, as if that mattered more than his own comfort or peace. Jack photographed the stone from every angle, captured the inscription in detail that would survive even if the stone itself eventually failed, then expanded his search pattern because there had been 3 bodies buried according to Thomas's letter, and there should be 3 graves. It was the 3rd grave that stopped his heart and made his hands shake as he cleared away the branches and debris that had accumulated during the storm. The stone was smaller than the others, cruder in execution, clearly made by hands less skilled than Brennan's, or working under conditions that made precision impossible. But the inscription was legible despite heavy weathering, despite lichen that had grown in the carved letters, despite more than a century of freeze and thaw that should have erased anything not cut deep enough. Thomas William Brennan, born 1876, died 1891, age 15. He came home. Jack stood absolutely still, reading the inscription again and again, while his mind tried to process implications that rewrote everything he thought he understood about Brennan's story, about Thomas's fate, about the cabin and its purpose. Thomas had come back. The boy Brennan had sent away at 9 years old to save his life had survived the orphanage, had grown, had remembered, had found his way back to this remote valley that had no roads and barely had trails. Had come home. The journal entries Brennan had left behind gave no indication of this reunion. The final entries had expressed uncertainty about whether Thomas still lived, had documented anguish over not knowing his son's fate, had revealed a father dying without ever learning if his sacrifice had achieved its purpose. But here was evidence that Thomas had survived the years away, had made it to 15, had come back, and had died here anyway in the place his father had tried to save him from, buried beside the parents he had lost. Jack knelt in the mud beside the grave, heedless of cold water soaking through his pants, of the discomfort that would come later from wet fabric against skin. He examined the stone more closely with hands that trembled despite his attempt to control them. The carving was rough but determined, letters formed by someone who knew what words needed to be said but lacked the skill or tools to say them elegantly. Someone young, perhaps, or unskilled with stone, or working under emotional duress that made precision impossible while still demanding that the effort be made. The stone's placement was careful, though, positioned precisely in line with the other 2, aligned so that the 3 graves formed a family grouping that honored relationship even in death. Whoever had carved it and placed it had understood what mattered, had respected the bond between these 3 people, even if they had not known them personally. Who had carved the stone? Who had buried Thomas and marked his grave with words that spoke of return and completion? Brennan was already dead by 1891 according to his own headstone, had died in December 1889 according to the journal's final entry. Unless that date was wrong, unless he had lived longer than the journal suggested, unless there had been some final chapter that had not been documented, or unless someone else had been here, had found Thomas's body and given him burial appropriate to a child who deserved better than the wilderness typically allowed. Jack pulled out his camera with numb fingers and began documenting everything, taking dozens of photographs from every angle, capturing details that might matter later when he had time to think clearly rather than simply react to revelation. The stone itself, the inscription, the position relative to the other graves, the surrounding terrain, everything that might help future researchers or historians or whoever cared about such things to understand what had happened here. Then he sat back on his heels and let the full weight of discovery settle over him like wet canvas, heavy and cold and impossible to shrug off. A boy of 9 sent away to save his life, his father paying everything he had to ensure safe passage to Seattle and placement with people who would care for him. 6 years of separation, of wondering, of waiting for a father who never came because the father was dying alone in a cabin in a forest where mail did not reach. Then the boy at 15 returning to find graves instead of reunion, finding death where he had hoped for life, finding the end of the story instead of the beginning he had traveled so far to claim. 3 graves in wilderness, a family destroyed by westward migration and tuberculosis, and the simple, cruel mathematics of frontier survival that killed the hopeful as readily as it killed the foolish. The story Brennan's journal told was tragic enough, a man losing his wife and sending away his son to die alone, documenting engineering principles. But this coda made it almost unbearable in its completeness. Thomas had come home to die, had chosen this ending deliberately, had valued being with his parents in death more than living alone without them. It was then, as Jack stood on stiff legs and began to circle the gravesite in widening arcs, looking for anything else that might have been left behind, that he noticed something odd about Thomas's headstone that he had missed on first examination. A symbol had been carved into the base, almost hidden by mud and lichen and the buildup of organic matter that accumulated on horizontal surfaces. He knelt again and cleaned it carefully with water from his canteen and his bare hand, scrubbing gently to avoid damaging stone that was already fragile from age. The symbol emerged slowly from beneath the grime. A compass rose, 8 points radiating from a center, with letters marked at the cardinal directions. N-E-S-W carved with the same crude hand that had shaped the inscription above. And beneath the compass rose numbers. Faint but legible when you knew to look for them, when you understood they were there deliberately rather than accidentally. Coordinates. Geographic coordinates in a format that was archaic but recognizable. Degrees and minutes without the seconds notation that modern GPS used. The kind of coordinate system that would have been standard in 1891 when surveyors still used chains and compasses in astronomical observations to determine position. Jack pulled out his GPS unit and entered the numbers carefully, translating the old format into modern decimal degrees, double-checking each digit because mistakes in coordinates could put you miles away from where you intended to be. The unit calculated bearing and distance from his current position, 42.7 meters, bearing 215 degrees southwest. Something was buried or hidden at that location, something Thomas had marked using a system that would mean nothing to casual observers, but everything to someone who understood survey notation and coordinate systems. A Marine would understand, an engineer would understand, someone from a military family who had been taught navigation and had studied enough history to recognize old formats would understand. Thomas had left a message for exactly the kind of person his grandfather had been, exactly the kind of person Jack was. The thought made him shiver with something that was not cold. He stood and oriented himself, carefully using the compass display on his GPS, then began to walk the bearing precisely, counting paces to estimate distance independently of the GPS readout because electronics failed and training endured. The ground sloped downward slightly, water still draining from yesterday's storm in small rivulets that sought the path of least resistance, making footing treacherous where mud had turned to slurry. At 30 meters, he slowed his pace and began scanning the ground more carefully for anything that looked disturbed or deliberately placed. At 40 meters, he stopped and shifted to a tight grid pattern search, moving carefully, looking at the ground with the intensity that explosive ordnance disposal technicians used when searching for buried IEDs. He almost missed it despite his care. A flat stone, larger than most of the others scattered across the forest floor, positioned with its flat face upward in a way that nature would not have arranged it without human intervention. Natural stones tumbled randomly, settled at angles determined by gravity and the spaces between other stones. This one sat deliberately level, its orientation too perfect to be accident. He cleared away the leaves and accumulated organic matter that covered it and found it was not a single stone, but a cap, a shaped piece of granite fitted carefully over a depression that had been carved into larger bedrock. The fit was precise enough that water had not penetrated, tight enough that a century of freeze and thaw had not shifted it. He lifted the cap with effort, surprised by the weight, and set it aside. Beneath was a cavity perhaps 18 inches deep and a foot square, dry despite the storm, sealed carefully with oiled canvas that had somehow survived decades of temperature extremes and humidity that should have rotted any organic material. The canvas was brittle when he touched it, but intact, still performing the function for which it had been selected. He unwrapped it layer by layer, moving slowly to avoid tearing fabric that wanted to crumble. Inside was a metal strong box, military issue, identical in design and manufacture to the one he had found in the cabin. This one was locked, but the lock was rusted through, weakened by time until it was purely symbolic. It broke when Jack applied pressure with his knife blade, the metal parting with a sound like a sigh. He lifted the lid and found items wrapped in more oiled canvas, in layer upon layer of protection that spoke of someone who understood preservation, who had thought about how to protect things against time and elements. Jack's hands shook as he lifted them carefully into morning light. Military medals, 3 of them, tarnished but structurally intact. He recognized them even before reading the inscriptions that were standard across all versions. Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration, awarded for conspicuous gallantry at risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. A second commendation, the second highest military decoration, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. Purple Heart, awarded for wounds received in action against an enemy. All 3 awarded to Captain William Brennan for actions during the Civil War at battles whose names were written in American blood. Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg. These were the medals Brennan should have been buried with, the honors that should have accompanied his body to whatever rest he found, that should have marked his grave as belonging to someone who had served and sacrificed at the highest level. Instead, they were here, hidden, protected, waiting for someone to find them and understand what they represented. With the medals was a packet of letters tied with string that had rotted almost completely, but still held the bundle together through habit and friction. Jack untied them as carefully as he could, aware that any rough handling might destroy paper that had survived against all odds. The letters were in surprisingly good condition despite age, protected by the oiled canvas in the sealed cavity and sheer luck. He unfolded the first one and began to read, squinting in the morning light, and felt the story snap into focus with painful clarity. The first letter was from Reverend John Chapman in Seattle, dated April 1886, written in response to a letter from Brennan that must have arrived shortly after Thomas did. Captain Brennan, I write to confirm safe arrival of your son Thomas, who was delivered to my care by the wagon master Jacob Wells, whom you engaged for his passage. The boy is healthy in body, but much afflicted in spirit, as any child would be who has lost his mother and been separated from his father in short succession. He speaks little and weeps often, particularly at night when the other children are sleeping. I have placed him temporarily with the Morrison family, good Christian people who have agreed to foster him until such time as you arrive to claim him, as you indicated in your letter you would do when your business is concluded. The boy asks daily when his father will come. I tell him soon because that is what you wrote. Please advise when you will be able to collect him, so I may give him a specific date to look forward to. The words were kind, but the implication was clear. Come get your son. Do not leave him in limbo. Children need certainty, even if the certainty is hard. The next letter was dated 6 months later, November 1886, and the tone had shifted noticeably. Captain Brennan, I have received no response to my previous correspondence and begin to worry for your welfare. Thomas remains in foster care with the Morrison family, who have been good to him within the limits of their ability, but they are not his people and he knows it. He has stopped asking when you will come and now refuses to speak of you at all when I raise the subject. This silence concerns me more than the weeping did. Please respond to this letter at the address you provided so that I may assure the boy of your continued existence and your intention to honor the promise you made to him. The third letter was dated April 1887, nearly a year after Thomas had arrived in Seattle, and the kindness had been replaced by something colder, more formal, touched with disappointment and judgment. Captain Brennan, this is my final attempt to contact you regarding your son Thomas. I have received no response to multiple letters sent to the address you provided in the Washington Territory. The Morrison family can no longer care for the boy due to circumstances in their own household, and he must be placed elsewhere. If you do not respond to this letter within 60 days, I will have no choice but to assume you have either perished in the wilderness or chosen to abandon your paternal duties. Thomas will be placed in the Seattle Orphan Asylum, where he will remain until such time as he can be apprenticed to a trade or reaches the age of majority. I had hoped better of a man who served his country with such distinction and honor. War changes men, but I did not think it removed basic human decency. There were no more letters from Reverend Chapman. The correspondence ended with that final accusation, that judgment of a man who did not know that Brennan was dying, who could not know that the silence was not choice but circumstance, that letters sent to a cabin in a forest had no way to reach their destination. But there was one final document in the packet, written on paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had begun to tear completely through, that had been handled with a frequency that spoke of repeated reading, of words returned to again and again for comfort or understanding, or simply because they were all that remained. The writing was in a young hand, unsteady and uncertain, with spelling that suggested limited education and grammar that revealed someone learning to write by doing rather than through formal instruction. But the meaning was devastatingly clear despite the technical imperfection. Pa, I waited like you told me to wait. I waited for you to come to Seattle like you promised you would come when your work was finished. The Reverend said you would come, but you did not come. They put me in a home for boys who have no family, and the Reverend said it was temporary, but it was not temporary. I lived there 3 years, and they were not good to us. They said we were charity cases, and we owed them for every meal and every bed, and we had to work to pay our debt. I ran away when I was 12 because I could not stay anymore. I worked on fishing boats out of Seattle and on farms during harvest, and I saved every penny I could. I asked everyone I met if they knew the wagon trail west and how to find land claims, and I found a man who had been a surveyor who knew where the claims were recorded. It took me 2 years to save enough money and learn enough to make the journey. I am 15 now, old enough to do this alone. Do this? I came to tell you I forgive you for sending me away, because I understand now that you did it to save me. I came to tell you Ma's death was not your fault, and you should not blame yourself for not saving her. I came to tell you I love you, and I remember everything you taught me about being a man and keeping your word and finishing what you start. I found the cabin you built, and it is the finest thing I ever saw. I understand now what you meant about engineering and why you stayed to document it. I found Ma's grave, and I put flowers on it like I remember her liking flowers. I found your grave, and I carved the stone myself because you deserved a stone, and you did not have one yet. You have been dead 2 years. I was too late again. I am always too late. I am sick. Like you, were sick. Like Ma was sick. I cough blood every morning, and I am tired all the time, even when I just woke up. I know what that means because I remember what happened to Ma. There is a doctor in the settlement 20 miles from here who looked at me and said consumption and said I have months, maybe less. He said I should go to a sanitarium, but I do not have money for that, and I do not want to die in a sanitarium with strangers. I want to be here with you and Ma. I want to be home. I want to be where I belong, even if I belong with people who are not here anymore. I buried your medals here because they should be hidden safe, like you hid everything else safe. I marked the place with coordinates like you taught me about navigation and mapping. Someone will find them someday. I do not know who or when, but someone will. When they do, tell them Captain William Brennan was a good man who did his best with what he had. Tell them he did not abandon me. He sent me away to save my life, and I came back anyway because some things matter more than being safe. Being home matters more. Being with the people you love matters more, even if they are dead. I'm going to lie down now near Ma's grave where the flowers grow. I am very tired and I do not think I can walk back to the cabin. That is okay. I am home. That is all that matters. The letter was unsigned, but the implication was clear and terrible and complete. Thomas had written it knowing he was dying, had buried his father's medals in his own final testimony with the care his father had taught him, then had gone to lie down somewhere near his mother's grave. And someone, some passing stranger or late arriving friend, or perhaps no one until much later, had found his body and buried him there with a stone that said the only thing that mattered in the end. He came home. Jack sat in the mud with the letter in his hands, reading it again and again while the forest dripped around him and morning sun broke through the canopy in shafts that illuminated nothing, and his vision blurred with tears. He had not cried since the day they lowered Lisa into ground that was supposed to hold her forever but somehow had not, because she was gone and no amount of earth could contain the absence that remained. A boy of 15 dying alone in wilderness because he loved his father more than he loved safety, because he needed to say words that would never be heard by the person they were meant for, because coming home mattered more than survival, because being with family, even in death, was better than living without them. The devotion was almost incomprehensible in its purity, the sacrifice so complete it rendered every practical objection meaningless. The parallel was too perfect to be coincidence and too painful to be borne easily. Thomas had run from an orphanage at 12 years old, had worked aboard fishing boats, where boys were treated as disposable labor, and accidents were common enough to barely merit investigation, had saved money penny by penny for 3 years while growing up in ways no 12-year-old should have to grow up, all to find his way back to a father who was already dead. That level of devotion, that refusal to accept abandonment as final, that determination to come home regardless of cost, it spoke to something fundamental about the bond between father and son that transcended reason or survival instinct or any practical calculation of benefit. Jack's own sons had, in their way, run from him, though they had done it more subtly, more acceptably, in ways that society praised rather than questioned, because military service was honorable and teaching was noble, and both were better than admitting that what they really wanted was a father who stayed. Daniel had joined the Marines at 18, following his father's path with the kind of determined mimicry that looked like honor but felt like something more complex when you examined it closely. Something that might have been a search for connection, or might have been a desire to prove he could succeed where his father had failed at the basic task of being present. He was 32 now, a captain like Brennan had been, deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq or one of the other places where America sent its young men to do violence on its behalf. Making the same choices his father had made, prioritizing the same missions, missing the same moments with his own young daughter that Jack had missed with him. The cycle repeating itself like a genetic curse, like trauma passed through blood instead of behavior, like a family legacy that no one wanted but everyone inherited anyway. Jack had tried to talk to Daniel about it once during a brief leave between deployments, had tried to suggest carefully that maybe family mattered more than advancement, that a 3-year-old daughter needed her father present, not heroic, that the medals and the commendations and the efficiency reports that would make Colonel by 40 meant nothing compared to bedtime stories and soccer games and being there when she woke from nightmares. Daniel had looked at him with something very close to contempt and said that was rich, coming from a man who had missed every birthday, every Christmas, every school play and baseball game, and moment that actually mattered because the Corps had called and Jack had answered without hesitation every single time. The accusation had been delivered without heat, just flat statement of fact presented in the same tone Daniel might use to describe the weather or report grid coordinates, and that had made it worse somehow because it meant the anger had burned itself out years ago, and all that remained was acceptance of abandonment as normal. It was true, all of it was true, and Jack had no defense except the same one Brennan might have offered if Thomas had lived long enough to ask why he had been sent away. I did it for you. I did it to provide security. I did it because duty demanded it, and I could not refuse the call. But those words rang hollow when spoken to a son who would have traded every benefit and advantage for a father who stayed for dinner, who showed up at games, who was present in body and mind instead of physically there, but mentally already deployed to the next mission that mattered more than this moment. Michael had run in a different direction, away from everything military, everything structured, everything that reminded him of the system that had stolen his father, and returned a stranger who wore his father's face but had nothing behind the eyes that recognized his sons as priority. He taught high school history in a small town in Oregon, lived in a house with a garden where he grew vegetables and kept chickens, had a golden retriever named Riley, who probably got more consistent affection than Michael had ever received from Jack. He never called except on obligatory holidays, and then only briefly. Conversations that lasted exactly long enough to fulfill social obligation, but not long enough to risk actual connection. He had tried to explain once, during a Thanksgiving dinner that had been stiff and uncomfortable and marked by long silences, why he needed distance, why he could not be close to his father even when they occupied the same room. "You were never home," Michael had said quietly while pushing food around his plate. "Even when you were home, you were not home. Your mind was always somewhere else, always on the next deployment, the next mission, the next thing that mattered more than us. We learned not to expect you. We learned not to need you. And now you want us to just forget that and be close, and I do not know how to do that." Jack had tried to argue to explain that it was not a matter of more or less, that every mission had mattered because they all contributed to a world where his sons could grow up safe, where they had opportunities and freedom and futures that were not constrained by the kind of violence and chaos that existed in the places he had been deployed. Michael had just looked at him with sad eyes that held no anger, just exhaustion, and said that was the problem right there. That was the fundamental misunderstanding that defined everything. "You thought we needed a safe world. We just needed you. We needed a father who was present more than we needed security. We needed someone who showed up more than we needed someone who deployed to protect abstract principles." Both sons lost to him in different ways. One by following too closely, becoming the thing that had destroyed their relationship, perpetuating the cycle with his own daughter because he had learned no other model. One by fleeing too far, creating distance that could not be crossed even when Jack wanted desperately to cross it, even when he finally understood what had been lost and wanted to reclaim it. And both, whether they would admit it or not, shaped more by absence than presence, defined by what they had not received rather than what they had, carrying wounds that looked like independence but were really scars from abandonment that had never quite healed. He had sent them away, not physically but emotionally, had taught them through example that men did not stay, that love was secondary to mission, that family was what you came home to when duty allowed rather than the reason duty existed at all. The lessons had been unintentional but no less powerful for that. Children learned what they saw demonstrated, not what they were told. And what they had seen demonstrated repeatedly through childhood was a father who chose to leave, who valued strangers in distant countries more than the sons who bore his name, who answered every call to service and ignored every call for presence. And now here was Thomas, dead at 15 from the same disease that had killed his parents, having spent his final strength to come home and forgive a father who had made the same impossible choice Jack had made repeatedly, the same calculation that duty demanded and family paid for, the same prioritization that looked like honor but felt like betrayal when you were the one being left behind. The letter in Jack's hands felt like an indictment written across time, a message meant for him as much as for anyone who might find it. Tell them he did not abandon me. How many times had Jack told himself the same thing about his own sons, had rationalized absence as necessity, had framed deployment as duty rather than choice, had convinced himself that providing security was the same as providing love? Thomas had forgiven his father across death itself, had traveled to a grave to offer absolution for choices that had been made with good intention, if not good outcome. Jack wondered if his sons would be as generous when his time came, if they would come to his funeral out of obligation or genuine grief, if they would remember him with love, or with the kind of sad acceptance that came from lowered expectations met consistently. He carefully rewrapped the medals in the letters and placed them back in the strongbox with hands that trembled from cold and emotion in equal measure, then carried the box back to the cabin through forests that seemed darker despite the growing light, as if the revelation had drawn shadows from places they should not exist. His mind was racing, making connections he had been too tired or too shocked to make the night before, seeing patterns that had been invisible until the full story emerged. Lisa had known about this place. She had researched it, found it somehow despite its remoteness and obscurity, despite the fact that it appeared on no tourist maps and barely existed in official records. She had known about the cabin and the graves and probably about the letters too, had pieced together the story from historical archives and land records and whatever other sources she had discovered in the months before her diagnosis, when she had spent hours at her laptop researching something she would not discuss in detail. Inside the cabin, he set the strongbox on the table next to the other one Brennan had left, two containers of evidence spanning generations, and stood looking at them both while memory assembled itself into coherent pattern. Lisa, in the months before the cancer appeared, spending evenings researching genealogy, or so she said, telling him it was just curiosity about family history when he asked. He had not pressed because he had been preoccupied with his own concerns, with the difficult transition to retirement that felt more like defeat than accomplishment, with the sudden absence of structure that had defined his entire adult life and left him uncertain how to fill days that stretched empty and purposeless. But she had not been researching her own family. She had been researching his, tracing the Hartford line backward through generations with the same determined thoroughness she applied to everything she cared about, had found the connection to Colonel James Hartford through census records and military archives, had discovered the story of William Brennan through Civil War documentation and correspondence that had been preserved in libraries and historical societies, had located this cabin through land claim records that showed Colonel Hartford purchasing property in the Washington Territory and deeding it to a Captain Brennan who had served under his command. And then the cancer had come, aggressive and fast-moving, giving her months instead of years, stealing time that should have been hers to use. She had known she would not survive long enough to make this journey herself, would not live to see the cabin or touch the graves or read the letters that waited in strong boxes hidden by men who understood preservation. So she had left breadcrumbs for Jack to follow, had made him promise to finish the hike she could not complete, had trusted that he would find what she had found and understand what it meant not just about Brennan and Thomas, but about himself and his own sons. "Find what I found there," she had said from her hospital bed in the last days when morphine made speech difficult, but had not yet stolen her clarity completely. Not just the cabin, not just the history, but the meaning beneath them, the pattern of sacrifice and absence and love that tried to express itself through duty, but failed because duty was not love and could never substitute for presence, no matter how honorable the cause. She had given him one final gift disguised as a request, had sent him on a journey that was not really about honoring her memory, but about saving himself from the isolation he had chosen, about reconnecting with the sons he had lost to his own choices, about understanding before it was too late that the debts that mattered most were not the ones recorded in military records and official correspondence, but the ones written in the hearts of children who learned too young what it meant to be left behind. The cabin held him in silence while he processed revelation that should have been obvious years ago, but had required this journey to make visible. Outside, the sun climbed higher and the forest began the slow work of recovery from the storm. Water draining, trees settling, life resuming its patient insistence despite damage and loss. Jack pulled out his journal and began to write, documenting everything he had found, the graves and their inscriptions, the coordinates Thomas had left, the strong boxes and their contents, the story that emerged from evidence scattered across more than a century. As he wrote, another memory surfaced from years ago, a conversation he had mostly forgotten until this moment gave it new significance. His father near the end, weakened by the cancer that would kill him within months, pulling Jack aside at a family gathering and speaking words that had seemed cryptical at the time, disconnected fragments that made partial sense but added up to nothing coherent. "We owe someone," his father had said in the low voice of someone sharing secrets. "Our family, the Hartfords. We owe a debt that was never paid, and I do not even know who we owe it to anymore. My father told me about it when I was young, but he died before he could explain it properly, and I never followed up on it the way I should have. Something about the Civil War, something about a soldier who saved his life, or maybe it was his grandfather's life. I cannot remember the details anymore. He made me promise to remember the debt, to honor it if I ever figured out what it was and who it was owed to. I am making you promise the same thing now because I failed and maybe you will not." Jack had nodded and promised to remember, the way you promise things to dying parents, meaning it in the moment but knowing that life would bury the promise under more urgent concerns, that time would erode the details until all that remained was a vague sense of obligation to something undefined. And that was exactly what had happened. His father had died, and the promise had been filed away with other deathbed wishes that could not be fulfilled because they lacked specific, actionable content. Until now, until the debt had come due in a cabin built by the man who had saved Colonel Hartford's life, delivered by a wife who loved him enough to send him exactly where he needed to go. The duty was clear now in ways it had not been clear before. Find Thomas's story and tell it to whoever needed to hear it. Find Brennan's medals and ensure they reach the military museum or historical society or wherever medals of dead heroes belonged when their families were gone. Find whatever descendants existed and deliver the message Thomas had written in his final hours. The message that said everything came down to love and forgiveness and the need to come home, even when home was only graves and memories. But beneath that public duty was something more personal and more urgent. He needed to call his sons, needed to say words that had gone unsaid too long, because saying them meant admitting error, meant acknowledging that the choices he had made in the name of duty and honor had extracted costs he had refused to calculate. Thomas had forgiven his father across death itself, had traveled to a grave to offer absolution that could not be received but could at least be given. Jack needed to ask for forgiveness while he still drew breath, while his sons could still hear him, while there was still time to close circles that had been open too long. The storm had passed, but its work remained visible everywhere he looked. Trees down that would take years to decay. Ground torn and reshaped by forces that cared nothing for human preference. The landscape permanently altered by violence that lasted hours but left marks that would endure. Jack understood that his own life looked similar when viewed from sufficient distance. Structures he had built torn down by choices he had made. Relationships damaged by absences he had justified. Connections broken by priorities he had never properly questioned until forced to by evidence that could not be ignored. But damage could be repaired if you started soon enough and worked with enough determination. Brennan had taught him that through the cabin that still stood, despite everything the forest and time could throw at it, you assessed the harm honestly without flinching from what you found. You made a plan based on reality rather than hope. And then you began the work of reconstruction, not mourning what was lost, but building with what remained. The work would be hard. Rebuilding relationships that had atrophied took more effort than maintaining healthy ones. His sons might not want reconciliation, might have moved past the need for a father's approval or presence, might be content with the distance they had created as protection against further disappointment. But he had to try because trying was the only way to honor both Brennan's memory and Thomas's sacrifice and Lisa's final gift. He packed the strong boxes carefully, wrapping them in dry clothing from his pack to cushion them during the hike out that would be rough and demanding. He took one final set of photographs documenting the cabin's interior, Brennan's careful notes carved into wood, the stove that had kept him alive through the night. Then he banked the fire to coals, cleaned his sleeping area meticulously, and left everything as he had found it, except for the letters and medals that needed to come with him into the world where their story could be told. Before leaving, he stood in the center of the cabin one last time and spoke aloud to empty air and to the ghost of Captain William Brennan, who seemed to occupy the same space in ways that felt less metaphorical than real, less imagination than presence. "I found Thomas," Jack said to the silence. "He came home. He forgave you. And I will make sure everyone knows what you built here and why it mattered, and that you kept faith until the end. I will honor the debt my family owes yours, I promise." The cabin absorbed his words without comment or judgment. But something in the quality of silence felt like acknowledgement, like acceptance, like the closing of circle that had been open since December 1889, when a man had written his final journal entry, and since April 1891, when a boy had written a letter and then laid down to die with his parents in soil that was finally home. Jack shouldered his pack, adjusted the straps exactly as he had learned decades ago, and stepped outside into morning that promised nothing except the opportunity to begin walking back toward a life that needed significant repair. The trail would be hard, longer, and more difficult than the trail in, complicated by storm damage and exhaustion, and the weight of what he carried both in his pack and in his understanding. But hard did not mean impossible. Hard just meant you had to want the destination badly enough to endure the journey. Marines walked through worse terrain on purpose because the mission mattered. Hartfords kept their promises because their name depended on it. And men who finally understood what mattered found strength to do what needed doing, regardless of cost or obstacle. He began to walk, following compass bearing that would eventually intersect with maintained trail that would lead to roads that would lead to his truck and back to civilization where phones worked and computers accessed archives, and promises could begin the long work of being kept. Behind him, the cabin stood silent and patient as it had stood for more than a century, having fulfilled its purpose once again by sheltering another soldier through another storm, waiting for whoever came next with the same endurance that had sustained it through countless seasons. The three graves remained where they had always been, stones marking lives that had ended too soon, but had mattered nonetheless in ways that time had finally revealed. Catherine, who had trusted her husband to save her and had died anyway because some things could not be saved. William, who had built shelter and documented knowledge because those were the only immortality he understood. Thomas, who had come home to forgive and had died with his parents because being together mattered more than being safe. Their story was no longer lost to forest and time. And that, Jack understood as he walked into morning light, was the only immortality any of them had ever really needed or deserved. Jack had walked less than a mile when the sky began to darken again with ominous speed. He stopped on a slight rise and studied the clouds building to the west, the direction weather always came from in the Pacific Northwest, pushed inland by oceanic systems that gathered moisture and power over thousands of miles of open water. These clouds were different from yesterday's storm, darker, lower, moving faster, the kind that meteorologists called atmospheric rivers, narrow bands of concentrated moisture that could dump months of rain in days or even hours. His weather sense, honed by years of field operations where bad forecasts could kill people, told him this storm would be worse than the one that had driven him to the cabin. The barometric pressure was dropping fast enough that he could feel it in his sinuses and his old injuries. His right knee ached with the kind of deep bone pain that preceded serious weather. The air had that electric quality that came before lightning, that charged feeling that made the hair on his arms stand up even through his jacket. He calculated quickly. The cabin was maybe 20 minutes behind him at his current pace. The nearest maintained trail was at least 6 hours ahead through forest that was already compromised by yesterday's storm damage. 6 hours in increasingly bad weather with no guarantee the trail would even be passable when he reached it. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. He needed to turn back. Jack reversed course without hesitation or second-guessing, moving as fast as the terrain allowed, retracing his steps through debris that had seemed manageable in calm weather, but became treacherous as wind picked up and visibility began to degrade. The first drops of rain arrived before he made it halfway back, fat and cold, and driven by gusts that suggested worse to come. Within minutes, it had intensified to the point where he could barely see 20 feet ahead, where every step became a negotiation with mud and hidden obstacles. He reached the cabin just as the full force of the storm hit. Wind that had been gusty became sustained, a wall of moving air that pushed against him hard enough to affect his balance. Rain that had been heavy became torrential, drops merging into sheets that reduced the world to gray chaos. He stumbled through the door and through the latch, breathing hard, soaked despite his supposedly waterproof layers. The cabin was as he had left it, fire-banked but still holding coals, his earlier preparations still in place. He rekindled the stove quickly, needing heat and light both, then stripped off wet outer layers and hung them where they would not drip on his gear. Outside, the storm announced itself with thunder that rattled the walls and lightning that turned the small window white with strobing intensity. This was going to be bad, worse than yesterday. The kind of storm that killed trees and changed landscapes and reminded humans that nature did not negotiate and did not care about plans or schedules or the fact that someone needed to be somewhere else. Jack accepted that with the calm that came from experience, with situations beyond his control. He was here. The cabin would protect him as it had protected him before. When the storm passed, he would reassess and make new plans based on new conditions. He was unpacking the strong boxes to check for water damage when the cabin shuddered. Not the normal flex and give of a structure responding to wind load, but a deeper movement, a shift that suggested something fundamental had changed. Jack froze, every sense suddenly focused, years of training kicking in automatically. He set down the strongbox carefully and moved to the center of the cabin where he could assess the whole structure at once. Another shudder, dying. Shudder, accompanied this time by a sound like a rifle shot, timber cracking somewhere, not inside the cabin but close, very close. He moved to the window and peered out into rain that obscured everything, trying to locate the source. Lightning flashed, and in that brief illumination he saw it. A massive Douglas fir, perhaps 80 feet tall, leaning at an angle that was wrong, that was getting wronger even as he watched. Roots tearing from saturated soil with sounds like bones breaking. The tree was perhaps 30 feet from the cabin and falling directly toward it. Jack had perhaps 3 seconds to decide. Abandon the cabin and run into the storm, hoping to clear the impact zone. Or trust Brennan's engineering and stay inside, hoping the structure would deflect or absorb the impact. 3 seconds to calculate angles and mass and structural capacity, to bet his life on mathematics performed by a dead man more than a century ago. He stayed, dropped to the floor into the corner farthest from the window, and covered his head with his arms in the brace position he had used during rocket attacks in Iraq. The tree hit with a sound like the end of the world. The impact was not direct, but glancing. The tree's upper branches striking the roof at an angle that distributed force across multiple structural members instead of concentrating it at one point. The cabin absorbed the blow with a groan that sounded almost human, timbers flexing under load they were never designed to bear. The roof held, barely, but something had broken. Jack could hear it even over the storm, the distinctive sound of wood failing under stress. He waited for secondary collapse, for the cascade failure that happens when one structural member gives way and transfers load to others that cannot handle it. Waited for the roof to come down on him or the walls to buckle inward. The cabin held, damaged but intact, still standing. Jack rose carefully and assessed the interior by headlamp. The roof had a visible sag now where the tree branches pressed against it from above. Water was dripping through in 2 places where shingles had been displaced. The walls remained plumb, but he could see daylight through a new gap where one of the upper logs had shifted slightly. The damage was serious, but not catastrophic. Not yet. But the tree was still up there, still pressing down with thousands of pounds of force, and the storm was not finished. He needed to reinforce the structure before it failed completely. Needed to distribute the load away from the compromised section. Needed to shore up the weak points before they became failure points. Needed to do emergency structural work in the middle of a storm using whatever materials he could improvise because Brennan's careful engineering was being tested beyond its design parameters. Jack moved fast, drawing on 25 years of experience building and repairing structures in combat zones, pulling knowledge from training exercises in real-world applications and the muscle memory that came from doing something so many times that it became automatic. He dragged the heavy bench to a position beneath the worst sag and positioned it as a temporary support column. Not ideal, but better than nothing. He found loose boards from Brennan's woodpile and used them to create bracing between the bench and the roof, wedging them tight to transfer load. It was not enough. The roof continued to sag, millimeters at a time, but visibly if you watched long enough. The tree was still up there, pressing down, and rain was making it heavier, adding weight with every drop that soaked into dead branches. He needed to get outside and cut away the branches, needed to reduce the load before the whole roof gave way. But going outside in this storm meant exposure to lightning and wind, and the real possibility of hypothermia if he got soaked and could not get dry again. He had no choice. The cabin was going to fail unless he acted. Brennan had built this place to survive, but even the best engineering had limits. Jack pulled on every layer he had, covered himself as completely as possible, grabbed the small folding saw from his emergency kit, and stepped out into hell. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him off his feet. Rain came at him horizontally, driven with enough force to sting exposed skin. He could barely see the cabin wall in front of him, despite touching it. Lightning strobed constantly, turning the world into a nightmare of shadows and white light. He moved along the wall by feel, fighting for every step, until he reached the point where the tree pressed against the roof. The saw was designed for cutting small branches for firewood, not for doing serious timber work in a hurricane. But it was what he had, so it was what he would use. Jack climbed onto the fallen trunk with difficulty, found his balance on wet bark that wanted to throw him, and began sawing at the largest branch that pressed against the roof. The work was brutal. The saw wanted to bind in wet wood. His hands were numb within minutes. Rain obscured his vision and soaked through layers that were supposed to keep him dry. But he kept sawing because stopping meant failure, and failure meant the cabin collapsed, and with it any hope of preserving what Brennan had built. He cut through the first branch and felt the load shift slightly as it fell away. The cabin groaned but held. He moved to the second branch, larger and positioned at a worse angle. This one would take longer. His arms burned from the effort. His hands were bleeding from gripping the saw, though he could not feel the cuts through the cold. Lightning struck something close enough that the thunder arrived simultaneously with the flash, close enough that he could smell ozone and feel the electrical charge in the air. He kept sawing, kept working, because Brennan had spent months building this place, and Jack would not let it fall on his watch, would not let a storm destroy what a dead engineer had created to outlast himself. The branch finally gave way with a crack and tumbled down the sloped roof, more weight removed, more chance of survival. But his hands were shaking now, and his core temperature was dropping despite the exertion, and he knew he was approaching the limit of what he could do safely. One more branch, the largest one, the one causing the most stress on the structure. Jack positioned himself as well as he could and started cutting. The saw was dull now from the work it had done. His arms barely responded to commands. The storm screamed around him, and lightning turned the world white with strobing regularity. He cut with a rhythm born of desperation, pull and push and pull and push. Wet wood yielding in tiny increments that added up to progress measured in fractions of inches. The branch gave way suddenly, unexpectedly, and Jack nearly went with it as the trunk shifted under his feet. He caught himself on a stub of broken limb, held on with hands that had no strength left, and managed to slide rather than fall to the ground. The branch crashed down the roof and landed in mud that splashed high enough to hit him despite being 10 feet away. The load on the cabin roof was significantly reduced. Not eliminated, but reduced enough that the structure might survive until the storm passed. Jack crawled to the door on hands and knees because standing was beyond him now, got inside somehow, and collapsed on the floor just past the threshold. Water pooled around him from clothes that had absorbed more rain than fabric should be able to hold. He was shaking violently from cold that had gotten past his defenses and into his core. His hands were white and nerveless. His face felt frozen where rain had hit it directly. But the cabin had held. Brennan's engineering had survived another test. That was what mattered. He forced himself to move despite every signal his body sent that said stop, forced himself through the routine of getting dry and warm, because hypothermia killed quickly, and he had not survived combat in a storm, in emergency structural work, just to die on a cabin floor from exposure. He stripped off soaked layers with hands that barely functioned, pulled on dry clothes from his pack, and huddled close to the stove, adding fuel with mechanical persistence until heat began to push back against the cold that had invaded his bones. The shaking eventually subsided. Feeling returned to his extremities in waves of pain as circulation resumed. He wrapped his bleeding hands in clean cloth from his first aid kit and forced himself to eat and drink despite no appetite, because the body needed fuel to generate heat. Outside, the storm continued with undiminished fury, but inside the cabin held, damaged but functional, still providing the shelter Brennan had designed it to provide. Jack sat with his back against the wall and stared at the reinforced ceiling where his temporary bracing fought against the remaining weight of the fallen tree. The engineering was marginal now, balanced on the edge of adequacy, but it was holding. Brennan would have approved of the improvisation, of using available materials to solve immediate problems, of trusting mathematics over fear. That thought brought comfort that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. It was late afternoon by the time the storm began to ease, the rain lessening from torrential to merely heavy, the wind dropping from sustained fury to intermittent gusts. Jack assessed the cabin's condition with the systematic approach of someone trained to evaluate battlefield damage. The roof had held, but would need significant repair before winter snow added weight it could no longer bear. The walls had shifted, but remained structurally sound. The floor was wet in places, but the log structure underneath was intact. The cabin had survived, but it had been hurt. Brennan's engineering had saved them both, but it had been tested to the absolute limit of its capacity. As light began to fail and Jack prepared for another night in the cabin, he heard a sound that did not belong to wind or rain or forest settling after storm. A mechanical sound, rhythmic and growing louder, the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors beating air into submission. Search and rescue. Someone had reported him overdue. Someone cared enough to send people looking, despite weather that should have grounded all aircraft. Jack moved to the door and opened it, stepped out into rain that had diminished to drizzle, and watched as the helicopter circled the clearing, looking for a place to set down. It was a Marine Corps bird, a UH-1Y Huey, and that recognition hit Jack with unexpected force. The Corps took care of its own. Always had, always would. The helicopter settled into the clearing with rotor wash that bent trees and threw debris in all directions. The side door slid open and two figures jumped out, moving with the efficient urgency of Marines on a mission. Jack raised his hand to signal his position and watched as they ran toward him with weapons ready, because you always expected the unexpected and prepared for the worst. The lead figure reached him and stopped, and Jack's heart stuttered in his chest as recognition hit. Captain Daniel Hartford, his son, 32 years old and looking exactly like Jack had looked at that age. The same build and the same expression of controlled intensity, and the same eyes that assessed situations and calculated responses before speaking. His son had come for him. Dad. The word was delivered flatly, without emotion, a statement of relationship rather than affection. Are you injured? Jack shook his head, not trusting his voice, overwhelmed by the convergence of past and present, by seeing his son here in this place that had become about fathers and sons and the debts that passed between generations. Daniel's eyes swept the cabin, the fallen tree, the visible damage, calculating the situation with the training Jack had once admired and now saw as a mirror of his own failures. The second Marine was a corpsman, already unpacking medical gear, trained to assess and stabilize. Jack waved him off. I am not injured, just cold and tired. The cabin took most of the damage. Daniel keyed his radio and reported status to the helicopter, coordinates and condition and extraction requirements delivered in the clipped professional language of military communication. Then he turned back to Jack, and for the first time something that might have been emotion cracked through the professional mask. They called me when you did not check in, when your truck was still at the trailhead 3 days past your expected return. I was in Quantico for a course. I volunteered to lead the search because you are my father, even if you were never much of one. The words landed like blows, each one precise and devastating. Jack had no defense to offer, no counter-argument that would not sound like excuse or rationalization. He simply nodded, accepting the truth of the accusation, and waited for whatever came next. Daniel looked at the cabin again, really looked at it this time, seeing past the damage to the structure beneath. What is this place? Why are you here instead of on the trail you filed a plan for? Jack gestured towards the cabin. Come inside, I need to show you something. I need to tell you why this matters. They went inside and Jack watched Daniel's eyes take in the interior with professional assessment, noting the stove and the careful organization and the evidence of long habitation despite abandonment. Jack pulled out the strong boxes and opened them, revealing the medals and the letters and the journals that told a story spanning generations. He explained about Captain William Brennan and Colonel James Hartford, about the debt that had been owed and never paid, about Thomas coming home to forgive a father who had died before forgiveness could be received. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Marine discipline keeping everything locked down tight. When Jack finished speaking, the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before Daniel finally responded. So you found some dead guy's cabin and decided it was more important than getting back on schedule. You risked your life and mine and the lives of every Marine involved in this search because of a story about people who have been dead for over a century. Jack shook his head. That is not what this is about. Or maybe it is, but not the way you are making it sound. This is about debts that get passed down through families, about promises that outlast the people who made them, about fathers and sons and the things we owe each other that have nothing to do with money or property or official obligations. Daniel's jaw tightened, and Jack saw the anger that had been controlled suddenly fighting to break free. Do not talk to me about what fathers and sons owe each other. You do not get to lecture me about obligation or debt when you spent my entire childhood deployed to places that mattered more than home. When you chose the Corps over us every single time a choice needed to be made. Jack absorbed that, let it settle, recognized it as truth that deserved acknowledgement rather than argument. You are right. I failed you and Michael both. I prioritized mission over family and justified it with logic that seemed sound at the time, but looks like excuse now. I am not going to defend those choices because they cannot be defended. Then why are you telling me this story? Why am I standing in a cabin in the middle of nowhere listening to you talk about dead engineers and their dead sons like it has anything to do with us? Because Brennan made the same choice I made, Jack said quietly. He sent his son away to save his life, and the boy came back anyway and died here trying to find his father. He came back because being home mattered more than being safe. And I am telling you this because I do not want you to make the same mistakes with your daughter that I made with you. Daniel went very still, the kind of stillness that comes before violence or tears, teetering on an edge that could fall either direction. My daughter has nothing to do with this. She has everything to do with this. You are deployed more than you are home. You prioritize advancement over presence. You are following exactly the same pattern I followed, and it will end exactly the same way unless you choose differently. I lost you and Michael because I was never there. Do not lose Emma because you repeat my errors thinking they are virtues. The silence that followed was broken only by the storm outside and the crackle of the fire in the stove. Daniel stood with his hands clenched and his jaw working and his eyes locked on something only he could see. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he could not quite suppress. How dare you? How dare you stand there and tell me how to be a father when you have no idea what it takes, what it costs, what it means to choose between mission and family every single day. I learned from you that service matters, that duty comes first, that being a Marine means something more important than being comfortable or present or available. And now you want to tell me that was wrong? That everything you taught me through example was a lie? Jack felt something break inside his chest, some barrier he had maintained for decades suddenly collapsing under weight it could no longer bear. Not a lie, a mistake, a terrible mistake that cost me my sons and cost your mother years of loneliness and cost you and Michael a father who should have been there but was not. I taught you wrong, Daniel. I taught you that duty was more important than love, and I was wrong. Service matters, but family matters more, and I did not understand that until it was too late. The confession hung between them, raw and undefended, the kind of admission that changed relationships fundamentally or destroyed them entirely. Daniel stared at his father with an expression that cycled through anger and confusion and something that might have been grief for the relationship they had never had. Outside, the helicopter pilot called on the radio asking for extraction timeline, asking if they needed to stay on station or could return to base. Daniel ignored the call, his attention locked on Jack, and when he finally responded, his voice was quieter, but no less intense. What do you want from me? Why tell me this now? I want you to choose differently than I chose, Jack said. I want you to go home to Emma and be present in her life, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. I want you to make her more important than the next rank or the next deployment or the next mission that seems critical, but is actually optional if you are willing to say no. I want you to learn from my failures instead of repeating them. And if I cannot, if the core is who I am, not just what I do, if I am too much like you to choose differently, then you will lose your daughter the same way I lost you. And when she is 30 years old, she will look at you with the same distance I see in your eyes now. And you will understand what I am feeling in this moment. And I hope you are smart enough to grieve that loss before it is permanent instead of after. Daniel turned away and keyed the radio, giving extraction orders in a voice that shook despite his attempt at professional calm. The helicopter acknowledged and powered up, rotors increasing speed to prepare for departure. Daniel helped Jack gather the strong boxes and the gear that mattered, working in silence, handling the metals and letters with a care that suggested he understood their significance, even if he could not yet acknowledge it. As they prepared to leave, Daniel paused at the door and looked back at the cabin that had sheltered his father, and before that had sheltered others who understood what it meant to build something that lasted. Is it true? Did this kid really come back just to forgive his father? Jack nodded. He was 15 years old and dying from tuberculosis. He came back because being home mattered more than living longer somewhere else. Because he needed his father to know he was forgiven, even though his father was dead and could not hear him. Because some debts transcend death, and some bonds matter more than survival. Daniel absorbed that, filed it away in whatever mental space he kept the things that mattered, but could not yet be processed, and stepped out into weather that had calmed enough to allow helicopter operations, but was still uncomfortable. They moved to the helicopter and loaded the strong boxes under the corpsman's watchful eyes. Jack took one last look at the cabin that had saved his life and changed his understanding and given him the clarity to speak truth to his son, even though that truth hurt them both. Brennan's structure stood damaged but intact, the engineering sound despite storm damage that would have destroyed lesser work. The fallen tree lay across part of the roof like a monument to survival and adaptation, and the willingness to improvise solutions when perfect was impossible. 3 graves sat in forest nearby, stones marking lives that had ended too soon but mattered nonetheless, their story no longer lost to time. The helicopter lifted off with the distinctive sound of turbines winding up and rotors biting air, rising above trees that reached toward them like hands grasping for something forever out of reach. Jack sat in the troop compartment and watched the cabin shrink below them. Watched the clearing become just another patch in endless forest. Watched the place that had mattered so much become small enough to hold in his vision and then disappear entirely as they gained altitude. Daniel sat across from him in the crew chief's seat, close enough to touch, but separated by years of distance that one conversation could not bridge. But something had changed in the last hour. Some barrier had been acknowledged, if not demolished. Some truth had been spoken that could not be unspoken. The work of repairing what had been broken would take time and effort and probably pain. But it could begin now because Jack had finally admitted what needed admitting and Daniel had finally heard what needed hearing. The flight back to base took 40 minutes. The helicopter following valleys and roads that would lead to civilization and communication in the beginning of whatever came next. Jack watched forests give way to clear cuts and clear cuts give way to towns. And towns give way to the urban sprawl of Joint Base Lewis McChord, where Daniel's unit was temporarily stationed. The transition from wilderness to civilization happened too fast. The change too abrupt. The modern world reasserting itself before Jack was ready to let go of the simplicity that had existed in the cabin. They landed on the base flight line and offloaded gear in strong boxes with the efficient coordination of people trained to work together. A staff car waited to take them to the unit headquarters where reports would need to be filed and questions answered and official procedures followed because the Marine Corps ran on documentation and accountability. But before they got in the car, before they returned to the world of regulations and routine, Daniel stopped and turned to Jack with an expression that was no longer controlled or professional, but simply human. I need time to think about what you said. I cannot promise I will change or even that I can change, but I will think about it. That is all I can offer right now. Jack nodded, understanding that small concessions were all he could expect. That rebuilding trust required patience and consistent effort over time rather than dramatic gestures. That is enough. Thinking about it is more than I did at your age. Maybe you are already better at this than I was. They got in the car and drove to headquarters through a base that was both familiar and foreign to Jack. The structures and procedures recognizable from his own service, but the faces all young and unknown. He had been gone from active duty long enough to be forgotten, long enough that the Marines moving around the base had not served with him and did not know his name or his record. That anonymity was both freeing and unsettling. At headquarters, they were met by the battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel who thanked Jack for his service and apologized for the search and rescue operation being necessary, phrases delivered with the formal courtesy that officers used when speaking to senior retired personnel. Jack accepted the thanks and deflected the apology, explaining that the storm had been unpredictable and the cabin had been refuge, not destination. The commander listened and nodded and asked no difficult questions, understanding perhaps that some stories needed time before they could be told properly. Daniel walked Jack to the base visitor center where he could make phone calls and arrange transportation back to his truck, which was still at the trailhead 3 hours north. As they walked, Daniel spoke without looking at Jack, words that came with difficulty but needed to be said. Mom would have been proud of what you did, finding that cabin, Honoring that debt. She always said you had it in you to be the man she married instead of the Marine who replaced him. Maybe she was right. Jack stopped walking, the words hitting harder than Daniel probably intended. Your mother knew about the cabin. She found it before she died. She sent me there deliberately because she knew I needed to understand what Brennan understood. That building things that last matters. That debts need to be paid. That fathers and sons need each other in ways that have nothing to do with duty or obligation. Daniel turned to face him, surprise evident on features that usually revealed nothing. She knew? She found it and did not tell you? She was dying. She knew she would not live long enough to make the journey herself. So she left breadcrumbs for me to follow. She made me promise to finish the trail she could not complete. She trusted that I would find what she had found and understand what it meant. That was her final gift to me, forcing me to confront truths I had been avoiding for decades. What truths? That I failed as a father, that service was not substitute for presence, that the choices I made hurt the people I loved most, that I needed to change before it was too late. She sent me there to learn those lessons because she knew I would not learn them any other way. Daniel absorbed that, processed it against everything he knew about his mother and his father and the relationship between them that had always seemed solid despite the absences and the deployments and the years of separation. Did she forgive you before she died? Did she tell you that the failures were forgiven? Jack shook his head, throat tight with emotion that threatened to overwhelm his control. She did not need to forgive me because she never blamed me. She understood who I was, and she accepted it even when it cost her. But understanding and accepting are not the same as agreeing. She wanted me to be better. She died hoping I would learn to choose differently. And she left me the tools to do it even though she would not be there to see it happen. They stood in silence while Marines moved around them and the base went about its business, and the world continued turning regardless of their conversation. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice rough with emotion he was still learning to express. I will think about Emma, about being present instead of just providing, about choosing her over advancement. But I cannot promise results. This is who I have been trained to be. This is what I know how to do. Thinking about it is the first step, Jack said. Being willing to question your choices instead of just justifying them is how change begins. Your mother taught me that even if I learned it too late. Maybe you will be faster than I was. Maybe Emma will grow up with a father who is there instead of deployed. That would be the best way to honor your mother's memory. Daniel nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion that suggested he had reached some internal conclusion, and held out his hand. Jack took it, and they shook formally, the way Marines shake when duty is complete and paths are about to diverge. But then Daniel pulled him into an embrace that was brief and fierce, and spoke of emotion that could not find words, arms that had learned to hold weapons, learning to hold a father instead. The embrace broke and they separated, and Daniel stepped back to a professional distance, Marine bearing reasserting itself over the vulnerability that had briefly shown through. I have to get back to my unit. They will expect a report on the search operation. Stay safe, Dad. Call when you get home. Michael will want to know you are okay. Jack watched his son walk away across the base, watched until he disappeared into a building and was gone from sight. The strongboxes sat at his feet, holding medals and letters, and the story of men who had made similar choices for similar reasons. The work of honoring those stories and paying the debts they represented would begin soon. But first he needed to call Michael, needed to begin the harder work of repairing the relationship with his other son, who had fled instead of followed and might be even further from reach. But that conversation would wait until he was home, until he had time to prepare what needed saying. For now, he called a taxi to take him north to his truck, arranged transportation for the strongboxes to ensure they would not be damaged or lost, and began the process of returning to the life he had left when he set out on a hike that was supposed to be simple tribute to a dead wife, and instead became confrontation with everything he had done wrong. The taxi arrived, and Jack loaded his gear and gave directions north toward the Olympics and the trailhead where his truck waited. As they drove, he looked out the window at the landscape passing, at the transition from urban to rural to wild, and thought about Brennan and Thomas and the cabin that still stood in forest waiting for whoever came next. The story was not finished. The debts were not all paid. But the work had begun, and that was all anyone could ask. To begin the work of repair while there was still time. To honor the debts that mattered while the people who were owed them still drew breath. The storm had passed, but its effects would last. The cabin had survived, but it bore scars. And Jack had learned what he needed to learn, even though the learning had come hard and late, and at cost he was still calculating. Some debts took lifetimes to pay. Some lessons took decades to learn. But better late than never. Better to begin repair while there was still something left to rebuild. The taxi drove north into afternoon that was clearing toward evening, carrying a man who had gone into wilderness looking for tribute and found redemption, who had discovered a cabin built by a dead engineer and learned that the things we build outlast us only if we build them with care and intention, and the understanding that what matters most is not the structure, but the purpose it serves. Brennan had built shelter. Jack had found truth. Thomas had found forgiveness. Daniel had found questions that might lead to change. And somewhere Lisa was at rest, knowing that the trail she could not finish had been completed by the man she loved, that the lessons she could not teach directly had been learned through discovery, that the debt she had uncovered would finally be paid by the family that owed them. The wagon had stopped rolling more than a century ago, but its work continued. And that, Jack understood as miles passed and wilderness gave way to civilization, was the only immortality that actually mattered. Not the survival of structure, but the continuation of purpose. Not the preservation of names, but the honoring of debts. Not the avoidance of death, but the quality of the life lived before death arrived. He would pay the debts. He would repair the relationships. He would honor the promises. Because that was what Marines did. That was what Hartfords did. That was what men who finally understood what mattered chose to do with whatever time remained. The drive north to retrieve his truck took 3 hours through landscape that had been reshaped by the storm. Roads were littered with fallen branches. Power lines sagged where trees had taken them down. Work crews in orange vests cleared debris and restored infrastructure with the patient efficiency of people who knew this was not the first storm and would not be the last. Jack watched it all from the taxi window and thought about resilience, about the work of rebuilding that always followed destruction, about the choice to repair rather than abandon what had been damaged. His truck sat alone in the trailhead parking lot exactly where he had left it 4 days earlier, though it felt like much longer. He paid the taxi driver with a generous tip and stood for a moment looking at the forest that had nearly killed him and had instead taught him things he had needed to learn for decades. The trail entrance was marked with fresh yellow tape and warning signs, closed due to storm damage, impassable conditions, do not enter, appropriate warnings for a path that no longer existed in any meaningful form. Jack loaded his gear into the truck bed and secured the strong boxes in the passenger seat where he could keep them in sight. The medals and letters they contained were more than historical artifacts. They were evidence of promises made and debts owed in the continuation of purpose across generations. He would treat them with the respect they deserved. The drive home to Seattle took another 2 hours on highways that were functional, but crowded with storm debris being hauled away by contractors who would charge premium rates for emergency work. Jack used the time to think about what came next, to plan the steps required to honor Brennan's story and repair his own family. The tasks were different but related, both requiring patience and careful attention to detail and the willingness to persist despite obstacles. Home was a house that felt too large and too quiet, the same house he had shared with Lisa for 23 years, the same walls that held memories of a marriage that had endured despite his absences. He parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before going inside, preparing himself for the silence that would greet him, for the absence that had become the defining characteristic of the space. Inside, he unpacked methodically, putting gear away in its designated places, hanging wet items to dry, cleaning equipment that would need to be maintained for future use. The strong boxes he placed on the dining room table where Lisa used to spread her research materials, where she had probably worked when she was uncovering Brennan's story. The connection felt right somehow, as if by placing them there he was completing a circuit she had begun. He made coffee and sat at the table with the strong boxes and his laptop and began the work that would occupy him for weeks or months. First task was documentation. He photographed every item in the strong boxes from multiple angles with careful attention to lighting and detail. The medals with their ribbons faded but intact. The letters with their careful handwriting and official seals. The journals with their technical observations and personal grief written in the same disciplined hand. Each photograph was cataloged and backed up to multiple locations because these items were irreplaceable and their loss would be catastrophic. When he was satisfied with the documentation, he began research, using the internet and library databases and historical archives to trace what had happened to the people in Brennan's story. Captain William Brennan appeared in military records with commendations and efficiency reports that documented his service through the Civil War. Medal of Honor awarded for actions at Antietam, a second commendation for Fredericksburg, Purple Heart for wounds received at Gettysburg, a career of distinction that ended with honorable discharge in 1865 and then seemed to disappear into the vast anonymity of westward migration. Catherine Morrison Brennan appeared in census records and marriage records, and finally in mortality records that listed cause of death as consumption, buried in unmarked grave in Washington Territory. No children surviving was noted in the margin, an administrative detail that was factually wrong but understandable, given that Thomas had been sent away before his mother died. Thomas William Brennan was harder to trace. He appeared in orphanage records in Seattle, placement with the Morrison family in 1886, transfer to Seattle Orphan Asylum in 1887. Then nothing. No death certificate, no record of apprenticeship or employment. He had simply vanished from official documentation, as so many children did in that era, fallen through gaps in record keeping or buried in unmarked graves with no one to note their passing. But Jack had evidence that contradicted the official silence. He had Thomas's letter and the grave marker that said he came home. That was documentation enough, even if bureaucracy had failed to preserve it. Thomas had existed, had mattered, had made choices that deserved to be remembered. Jack spent 3 days in focused research before he made the first phone call to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. He explained that he had discovered a frontier cabin of significant historical and engineering importance, that it contained documentation from a Civil War veteran who had pioneered concepts of mobile living, that there were medals and letters and journals that told a complete story of westward expansion and family sacrifice. The person who answered transferred him to someone more senior, who transferred him to a curator who specialized in 19th century American history. Jack explained again, this time with more detail and specific information about dates and locations and the engineering sophistication of the structure. The curator listened with what sounded like polite professional interest until Jack mentioned the Medal of Honor and the connection to Colonel James Hartford. That name changed everything. Colonel Hartford appeared in military histories, his service documented and his contributions to Union victory recognized by historians. A cabin built by a man he had served with, a man who had saved his life. That was the kind of provenance that museums valued. The curator asked Jack to send photographs and documentation, promised to review them personally, suggested that if the material was as significant as described, there might be interest in preservation and exhibition. Jack sent everything he had digitized along with GPS coordinates for the cabin and detailed descriptions of its construction and current condition. Then he waited with the patience that decades of military service had taught him, understanding that institutions move slowly and decisions required committees and approvals that could not be rushed. While he waited, he made the call he had been avoiding. Michael answered on the fourth ring, his voice cautious in the way it always was when he saw his father's number on caller ID. "Dad, is everything okay?" Jack closed his eyes and forced himself to speak past the tightness in his throat. "I am fine physically, but I need to talk to you about something important. Do you have time?" Michael's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Sure, what is it?" Jack told him about the hike and the storm and the cabin, about Brennan and Thomas and the debts that passed through generations, about Daniel and the confrontation and the things that had been said that could not be unsaid. He spoke for 20 minutes without interruption while Michael listened in silence. When he finished, the silence stretched long enough that Jack wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I owe you an apology that I should have made years ago because I failed you as a father, and I want you to know I understand that now. Because I am trying to repair what I broke even though I know it might be too late." Another long silence. Then Michael's voice, quieter now, almost a whisper. "Do you know what it was like growing up with you always gone? Always deployed or training or preparing for the next deployment. Mom tried to make it seem normal, but it was not normal. Other kids had fathers who came to their games and helped with homework and were just there. We had stories about a father who was doing important things in important places but was never home." Jack let that land, absorbed it without defending or explaining, accepting it as the truth it was. I know. Or I am beginning to understand. I justified every absence with mission importance and told myself I was building a safe world for you to grow up in. But you did not need a safe world. You needed a father who was present, and I was not. I am sorry, Michael. I am deeply sorry for every missed game and every birthday I deployed through, and every year I prioritized duty over being your dad. The silence that followed was different, softer somehow, as if something that had been clenched tight was beginning to relax. I appreciate you saying that. I needed to hear it, even if it does not change what happened. I know it does not change the past, but maybe it can change what happens going forward. I would like to be part of your life if you are willing to let me try. Not as the father I should have been, but as the person I am now trying to become. Michael's breath shook on the other end of the line. I need time. This is a lot to process, but I am willing to try if you are serious about changing. I am serious, I promise you that. They talked for another hour, tentative and careful, exploring the possibility of relationship that had atrophied from neglect, but might be capable of regrowth if tended properly. Michael told him about his teaching, about students he was helping, about the garden where he grew vegetables and the simple satisfactions of work that produced visible results. Jack listened and asked questions and tried to understand the life his son had built in deliberate contrast to everything Jack represented. When they finally ended the call, Jack sat with the phone in his hand and felt something that might have been hope or might have been the beginning of forgiveness working its way through the decades of distance. It was not reconciliation yet, but it was possibility, and that was more than he had expected. 2 weeks after his initial contact, the Smithsonian curator called with news that the review committee had evaluated his documentation and wanted to send a team to assess the cabin in person. They proposed a date 3 weeks out, dependent on weather and trail conditions improving enough to allow access. Jack agreed and provided detailed directions and offered to guide them personally if needed. The team arrived on schedule, 3 people with expertise in historic preservation and frontier architecture and military history. Jack met them at the trailhead and led them through forest that was still recovering from the storm, following a route that had been partially cleared by Forest Service crews but remained challenging. The curator, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Sarah Chen, kept up with the pace despite the difficult terrain and asked intelligent questions about the cabin's construction and Brennan's documentation. When they reached the clearing and the cabin came into view, Dr. Chen stopped and stared in silence for a long moment before speaking. My God, it is intact. Actually intact after all this time. The team spent 6 hours documenting every detail, taking measurements and photographs and structural assessments, examining Brennan's notes and the engineering solutions he had implemented. They were particularly impressed by the stove installation and the double wall construction and the roof design that had shed snow and rain for more than a century. Dr. Chen made notes constantly, her enthusiasm growing as she understood the sophistication of what they were seeing. This is extraordinary, she said as they prepared to leave. This is not just a cabin. It is a complete system for mobile living designed by someone who understood engineering principles that were not formalized until decades later. The documentation he left is as valuable as the structure itself. This needs to be preserved. Jack showed them the graves and explained Thomas's story, and watched as the historians absorbed the human dimension of what they were evaluating. This was not just architecture and engineering. This was family tragedy and frontier hardship and the choices people made when survival required sacrifice. That narrative depth made the cabin more than artifact. It made it testament. The Smithsonian team returned to Washington with their documentation, and 3 months later, Jack received formal notification that the museum wanted to preserve the cabin and create an exhibition around Brennan's story. The structure would be carefully disassembled, each piece numbered and documented, then reassembled inside a climate-controlled gallery where it could be preserved indefinitely and accessed by researchers and visitors. The logistics were complex and expensive, but the museum had secured funding from donors who understood the historical significance. A specialized team would handle the disassembly and transport. The graves would remain in place but would be protected and marked with proper headstones identifying the people buried there. The site would be designated as historic and protected from development or disturbance. Jack coordinated with the museum and with the Washington State Historical Society and with the Forest Service to ensure everything was done properly and legally. He traveled to the cabin site 3 more times over the following months, watching as experts carefully documented and removed each board and log, as the structure that had stood for more than a century was taken apart and prepared for its journey to a new kind of permanence. On the final visit before the cabin's departure, he stood alone in the clearing where Brennan had stopped and decided to stay, where Catherine had died and Thomas had returned and Jack had learned what he needed to learn. The cabin existed now only as a footprint in disturbed soil and a gap in the forest canopy where trees had grown around it for generations. But the absence was not loss, it was transformation. The structure was being preserved so its story could be told to people who would never have found it in wilderness. He visited the graves and stood before each stone, speaking aloud to people who had been dead longer than he had been alive. Catherine Morrison Brennan, who had trusted her husband to save her and had died anyway. William Brennan, who had built shelter and documented knowledge because those were the only immortality available to him. Thomas William Brennan, who had come home to forgive and had found only graves but had chosen to stay anyway because being together mattered more than being safe. "I honored the dead," Jack said to the quiet forest and the stones that marked the dead. "Your story will be told. Your sacrifice will be remembered. The promises that were made will be kept." The forest offered no reply, but the silence felt like acceptance. The cabin reassembly at the Smithsonian took 8 months of careful work by specialists who understood historical preservation. Jack visited twice during the process, watching as Brennan's engineering was revealed in reverse, seeing how each piece fit together with precision that modern power tools could not improve upon. The craftsman working on the project spoke with respect about the builder's skill, about the solutions he had implemented without benefit of formal training or modern materials. When the cabin was finally complete in its gallery setting, recreated exactly as it had stood in the forest, the museum scheduled a dedication ceremony and exhibition opening. Jack was invited as the person who had discovered the site and donated the artifacts. He brought the strong boxes containing the medals and letters and journals and watched as they were placed in climate-controlled display cases where they would be preserved and protected while remaining visible to visitors. The exhibition was titled Endurance, Engineering, and Family on the Frontier. It told Brennan's complete story using his own words from the journals, using photographs of the cabin and the construction details, using the medals and letters to document his service and the promises that connected families across time. Thomas's story was included. His final letter displayed with explanation of how he had returned and why he had made that choice. The opening reception drew historians and military officials and descendants of Civil War veterans who understood the sacrifices that had been made. Jack stood in front of the cabin and answered questions from visitors who wanted to know how he had found it and what it had been like to shelter there during the storm. He told them about Brennan's notes and the stove that still worked and the engineering that had saved his life. But the moment that mattered most came when a Marine Corps general approached him with a document bearing official seals and signatures. "We have reviewed Captain Brennan's service record and the evidence you provided. The Medal of Honor he was awarded has never been formally presented to his family. We would like to correct that oversight." Jack stared at the document, understanding what it meant. The Marine Corps taking care of its own, even across service branches and centuries, honoring a debt to an Army engineer who had served before the Corps existed in its modern form. The ceremony would be held at Arlington National Cemetery, where Colonel Hartford was buried, bringing the story full circle. The presentation ceremony was scheduled for 3 months later on a cold November morning. Jack stood at attention in his dress blues, wearing the uniform for the first time in 9 years, as the general presented Captain Brennan's Medal of Honor in a shadow box along with his other decorations. No family members were present to receive them because no descendants had been found despite extensive searching. The medals would return to the museum, but this ceremony mattered. This official acknowledgement that William Brennan had served with distinction and his sacrifice had not been forgotten. After the ceremony, Jack walked alone to Colonel Hartford's grave in Section 60, where Civil War veterans rested in long rows marked by white marble stones. He found the marker and stood before it, seeing his own last name carved in stone from 1901, seeing the military rank and the dates of service, and the simple phrase that summarized a life, "faithful unto death," the same phrase Brennan had carved on his own stone. Not coincidence, but connection. Two men who had served together and had kept faith with each other across decades and death. Jack pulled a photograph from his pocket, A copy of the one that had been in Brennan's strongbox showing two men in Union uniforms standing before a half-built bridge. Colonel Hartford and Captain Brennan. He placed it against the base of the headstone and secured it with a small stone. "The debt is paid," he said quietly. "Your promise was kept. Brennan's story is told and his medals are honored and his son's forgiveness is documented. It took 6 generations, but the Hartfords kept faith." He stood a while longer, then walked to a different section of Arlington where Lisa was buried. Her stone was newer, the marble still white and clean, the dates marking a life that had ended too soon. He knelt beside it and placed his hand flat against the cold surface. "I found what you sent me to find," he said. "I learned what you wanted me to learn. I have started to repair what I broke." Daniel is thinking about being more present with Emma. "Michael and I are talking again. It is not fixed yet, but it is beginning. Thank you for the gift, even though I did not understand it at the time." He stayed until cold drove him back to his car, then drove home through Washington traffic with a sense of completion that had been missing for months. The public debts had been honored. Brennan's story was preserved. The promises were kept. But the private work of reconciliation with his sons required ongoing effort and attention. Over the following months, he developed new patterns and routines. Weekly phone calls with Michael that started stiff and formal, but gradually became easier as they found topics they could discuss without tension. Baseball, gardening, the small details of daily life that built connection through accumulation rather than dramatic gesture. Michael invited him to visit Oregon and Jack went, spending a weekend helping in the garden and meeting Riley the golden retriever and eating meals at a table where conversation flowed more naturally than it had in years. Daniel's transformation was slower and more complicated. He remained deployed for 8 months after their confrontation at the cabin, serving in a combat zone where communication was sporadic and video calls were interrupted by operational demands. But when he returned on leave, he brought Emma to visit, and Jack saw his granddaughter for the first time in 2 years. She was 5 now, bright and energetic and completely unaware of the family dynamics that had kept her grandfather distant. They spent the day at a park, and Emma climbed on playground equipment while Daniel watched with the intensity of someone who had missed too much and was trying to make up for lost time. Jack observed his son, observing his daughter, and saw the beginning of understanding, the recognition that presence mattered more than the career advancement he had been chasing. "She does not know me," Daniel said quietly as Emma played with other children. "She knows I am her father, but I am not familiar to her the way her mother is or her other grandfather who lives close and sees her every week. I am the man who appears occasionally and then leaves again." "It is not too late to change that," Jack said. "You can request assignment that keeps you stateside. You can prioritize being there over the next promotion. It will slow your career, but you will have a relationship with your daughter. I cannot make that choice for you, but I can tell you that no amount of rank or decorations or efficiency reports will matter when you are my age and your daughter is Michael's age, and the distance between you feels permanent." Daniel absorbed that in silence, watching Emma run and laugh with the unself-conscious joy of childhood that would not last much longer. "I put in a request for instructor duty at Quantico. 3 years of stable assignment with weekends home. If it gets approved, I will be there for first grade and second grade and third grade. I will be the father who shows up to school events and helps with homework." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion that threatened to overwhelm his control. "That would be good. That would be the best way to honor your mother's memory and to break the cycle that has damaged our family for 2 generations. They sat in silence watching Emma play until she ran over demanding that both her father and grandfather push her on the swings. They complied and she laughed with delight, and for a moment the past did not matter and the future looked different from what it had looked before. 6 months after the Smithsonian exhibition opened, Jack received a letter forwarded through the museum from a woman in California named Jennifer Brennan Collins. She had seen the exhibition during a visit to Washington and recognized the name from family stories her grandmother had told before dying. Her grandmother had been raised by an uncle who had come west in the 1880s and claimed to have a brother who disappeared in Washington Territory. The dates matched. The names matched. Jack called her immediately, and they spent 2 hours comparing family histories and documentation. Jennifer had minimal information about her ancestor, but she had photographs and family Bibles and stories that had been passed down. Together, they constructed a probable genealogy. William Brennan had a younger brother named Joseph who had remained in Philadelphia. Joseph's children knew that Uncle William had gone west with his wife and son and had never returned. The family had assumed they died in transit or settled somewhere so remote that communication was impossible. Jennifer cried when Jack told her about Thomas's letter and his return and his forgiveness. She had descendants. Thomas's choice to come home meant she existed. The line had continued through Joseph, but the story belonged to William and Catherine and Thomas, who had sacrificed everything for the possibility of something better. Jack arranged for Jennifer to visit the exhibition and meet with museum staff and see the medals that her ancestor had earned and never received. She stood before the display case crying openly while reading Thomas's letter about forgiveness and coming home. "This is my family," she said. "These people who died so long ago are my people, and I never knew their story." The museum added her to their files as a documented descendant and included her family photographs in the exhibition. William Brennan was no longer a historical abstraction. He was someone's great-great-great-uncle, someone with family who cared about his story and wanted his sacrifice remembered. 1 year after Jack's initial hike, he returned to the cabin site with both his sons and his granddaughter. The Forest Service had cleared a better trail and installed markers explaining the historical significance of the location. The graves had been properly maintained with new stones that included biographical information and the dates of birth and death. Catherine Morrison Brennan, William Brennan, Thomas William Brennan. 3 people who had tried to build something better and had died in the attempt, but whose story had survived to teach others about sacrifice and engineering and the choices families made on the frontier. Emma placed wildflowers on each grave, carefully selected from varieties that grew nearby, acting with the solemnity children adopt when they understand something matters even if they do not fully grasp why. Daniel stood with his arm around his daughter, and Jack saw in his son's face the same expression he had seen in the mirror after Lisa died. The recognition that time was finite and choices mattered, and the people you loved would not always be there. Michael stood slightly apart, observing rather than participating, still maintaining some distance but present in a way he had not been for years. He had driven up from Oregon specifically for this visit, had taken time off from teaching to be here, and that effort meant more than words could express. They stood together in the clearing where the cabin had stood, and Jack told them the complete story. About Brennan building shelter to save his wife and failing. About Thomas being sent away and coming back. About the letters and the medals and the promises that had waited more than a century to be honored. About Lisa finding this place and sending Jack here because she knew he needed to learn what Brennan had learned. That duty was not substitute for presence. That building things that lasted required more than engineering and materials. Emma listened with the focused attention children give to stories about real people who lived in different times. When Jack finished, she asked the question that mattered. Did the daddy and the boy ever see each other again before they died? Jack knelt so he was at her eye level and spoke gently. No, Emma, the daddy died before the boy could get back. But the boy wrote a letter saying he forgave his daddy for sending him away. He said he understood why his daddy did it, and he was not angry. That forgiveness mattered even though his daddy could not hear it. Why did he forgive him if he was not there to hear it? Because forgiveness is not just for the person being forgiven, it is also for the person who forgives. It lets them stop being angry and sad about what happened. It lets them remember the good things instead of just the bad things. Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense to her 5-year-old logic and went back to arranging flowers on the graves. Daniel caught Jack's eye and something passed between them, some understanding that transcended words, some acknowledgement that the lessons of this place were still being learned and would need to be relearned by each generation. They hiked out as the afternoon light slanted through the trees, Emma riding on Daniel's shoulders, chattering about the people they had visited, and Michael walking beside Jack in companionable silence. It was not the family they might have been if Jack had chosen differently decades ago, but it was the family they were becoming now through conscious effort and mutual commitment to repair what had been damaged. At the trailhead, they separated to their respective cars, Daniel heading back to base with Emma, Michael to Oregon, Jack to Seattle. But they had plans to meet again in a month. Tentative but sincere, building toward something that looked like reconciliation through small, consistent steps. Jack drove home as evening fell and the Olympics faded into purple silhouette against the western sky. The house waited empty and silent, but less oppressive than it had felt a year ago. He had work to continue, relationships to tend, promises to keep. The public debt to Brennan had been honored. The private debt to his sons was being paid in installments of presence and attention and the willingness to admit error. In his study, he kept the shadow box that held replicas of Brennan's medals, the museum having allowed him to retain copies after the originals were installed in the permanent collection. He looked at them often when he needed reminding of what mattered. Not the medals themselves, but what they represented. Service, sacrifice, the choice to build things that outlasted the builder, the faith that others would continue the work you began. Lisa's photograph sat on the desk beside the shadow box, her smile captured in better days before cancer stole her strength but not her clarity. She had known what he needed before he knew it himself. She had sent him into wilderness to find a cabin, and through the cabin to find truth about himself and his failures, and the possibility of redemption through honest effort. He picked up her photograph and studied her face, seeing in it the patience and the love and the understanding that had sustained their marriage despite his absences. "I am trying," he said to the image. "I am repairing what I broke. I am being the man you deserved instead of the Marine who replaced him. It is late, but not too late. Thank you for showing me the way." The photograph offered no answer, but he felt her presence anyway, felt her approval in the silence, felt her satisfaction that the mission she had set him on was being accomplished, even though she could not see the results. Outside, darkness completed its claim on the day, and lights appeared in houses where families were gathering for dinner and evening routines. Jack made himself a simple meal and ate it at the table where he had first opened the strong boxes and begun the research that led to preservation and recognition and the honoring of debts that had waited 6 generations to be paid. The wagon that Brennan had converted to fortress sat now in a museum where hundreds of thousands would see it and learn its story. The medals he had earned hung in display cases beside the letters he had written and the journals he had kept. The graves were marked and protected and included in historical registries that would preserve their significance. The debt Colonel Hartford had promised to honor was finally discharged by a descendant who had not known it existed until wilderness and wisdom and a wife's final gift brought it to light. Some structures were built to move and some to stay, and the best ones did both, serving different purposes in different times, adapting to needs they were never explicitly designed to meet. Brennan's wagon had carried his family west, and then had stopped and become shelter, and then had become testament, and now was teaching tool, helping others understand what engineering and determination could accomplish even in impossible circumstances. Jack's life had followed a similar pattern, built for military service and movement between deployments, then stopped by retirement and loss and the discovery that movement without purpose was just restlessness. Now being rebuilt around different priorities, different purposes, the architecture of relationship that required sustained presence rather than intermittent visits. The work would continue, the relationships would develop, the promises would be kept. Not perfectly because perfect was impossible, but faithfully because faith was all anyone could offer. Marines kept moving forward. Hartfords honored their debts. And men who finally understood what mattered chose presence over glory every chance they got. The cabin had waited more than a century for the right person to find it at the right time. Jack had found it when he needed it most, when Lisa's absence had created space for truth to fill, when failure could finally be acknowledged and addressed. The timing was not coincidence. It was precision, born of love and planning, and a wife who understood her husband better than he understood himself. Some debts took lifetimes to pay. Some lessons took decades to learn. Some relationships required patient rebuilding over years of small, consistent efforts. But the alternative to trying was accepting loss as permanent when it might be repairable. And Jack had learned in a cabin in a storm that things carefully built could survive forces that should destroy them if the engineering was sound and the purpose was clear, and the will to maintain them persisted beyond comfort or convenience. He would maintain this, the relationships with his sons, the honor shown to Brennan's memory, the presence his granddaughter deserved, the faith that what was broken could be mended if you started soon enough, and worked carefully and accepted that perfection was impossible, but improvement was always available. The wagon had stopped rolling in 1885 when Brennan decided to stay rather than continue west, but its work had never stopped. It had sheltered his family. It had protected his documentation. It had saved Jack's life. It had taught lessons about duty and sacrifice and the difference between building for yourself and building for those who would come after. Now it would teach those lessons to others in a museum where people came to learn about history and left understanding something about themselves. The cycle would continue. The story would be told, the promises would be kept. And somewhere Captain William Brennan and his son Thomas rested in forests that had claimed their bodies but not their significance, knowing that faith had been rewarded and effort had mattered, and love had outlasted death itself to complete the work they had begun. Jack finished his meal and cleaned his dishes and prepared for another day that would bring small opportunities to honor the debts that mattered. In the morning, he would call Michael. In the afternoon, he would work on the article he had been writing about Brennan's engineering innovations. In the evening, he would video call with Daniel and Emma. Small acts of presence that accumulated into relationship the way small cuts of the saw had accumulated into felled branches and structural salvation. The house settled around him with the familiar sounds of cooling wood and distant traffic. Outside, the city continued its restless motion. But inside, there was stillness and purpose, and the beginning of peace that came from knowing that late was not the same as never. That wrong could be acknowledged and partially corrected, that the work of being better began whenever you decided to begin it. He would begin again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day that followed until the work was done or he lacked the strength to continue. That was all anyone could promise: to begin and to persist, to honor and to repair, to build things that outlasted you by building them with care and purpose and the understanding that what you left behind mattered more than what you took with you. The cabin had taught him that. Lisa had taught him that. Brennan and Thomas had taught him that across the gulf of death and time. And now he would teach it to his sons, and through them to his granddaughter, and through her to whoever came after. The lessons passing down through generations like genetic code, like family tradition, like the debt that had taken 6 generations to honor and would require eternal maintenance to preserve. Some things were worth the effort. Some promises deserved keeping. Some debts demanded payment regardless of how long they waited. And some men learned late what they should have known early, but learned it thoroughly enough to matter despite the delay. Jack Hartford was one of those men. And that, he understood, as he turned off lights and prepared for sleep in a house that felt less empty than it had, was enough. Late but sufficient, imperfect but honest, the best he could offer and better than what he had offered before. The wagon had stopped. The work continued, and that was how things were meant to be.